1126 Social justice saving the world. Rolling waves smashed against the ship. As they shattered millions of tiny droplets against the invincible steel, the radar and missile launchers on the guided missile cruisers were active and ready, waiting for the command to fire. "Sir." The young soldier looked at the officer. He was unsettled, as it was difficult to distinguish whether it was firm or panic in his green pupils. "What should we do? What should we do?" No one could answer the young soldier who had just left the military academy. Even the seasoned veteran couldn't. Since they were standing there, they were soldiers, just negligible screws in the massive war machine. They couldn't make the decision. Instead of thinking about this question without an answer, it would be better to think about a more realistic question. What will we do? Everyone asked the question in their mind, including the new recruits on the warships, including, of course, the one standing on the bridge. Hogg showed nothing but malice as his destruction-filled pupils already narrowed into a line, like the celestial trade fleet that lined up on the high sea. The Pacific Fleet, more than 150 kilometers away, responded affirmatively to the joint fleet with the first round of shelling. He made a decision immediately, including forming the attack formation, sending out fighters, and sending out the destroyers. He couldn't act weak. Not even a bit. Even if he wasn't willing, he could only move forward. Representatives of the countries watched him. The capital, his people, and the world were all watching him. The countless gazes on him were like countless swords pressed against his back. Celestial trade fighters are approaching quickly. Our radar can't lock onto them. The lieutenant admiral said nervously. "All fighters take off." Hogg ordered. "Roger." The lieutenant admiral gnashed his teeth. He already expected this to happen. When Zinn and Kuntrev fought previously, they verified that the F-35 was no match for the Aurora 20. However, despite this, he had no fear. Although the Aurora 20 was strong, it wasn't invincible. Under the cover of destroyers and missile cruisers, even if a group could only take out a squadron, the final victory would only belong to the joint fleet. Although the electromagnetic pulse cannon was powerful, the ship carrying the cannon was still made out of steel. Anti-ship missiles and anti-ship torpedoes would take care of them, even if they could sink a few warships or even the aircraft carrier in the center. But what else? As for space-based weapons, at a distance of 36,000 kilometers, it would still take some time before those landed. Hogg felt a lot more at ease after he issued the orders consecutively. It seemed that the war was bound to happen. 20 kilometers left. 20 kilometers. At the current speed of the destroyers, they would close the distance in just a few minutes. By the time, the joint fleet would have crossed the red line, and the Celestial Trade Pacific Fleet would respond with their electromagnetic pulse cannons. With the war bound to happen, there seemed to be no other alternatives. When Lei Zheng received the report, he looked at the red dots that were gradually approaching on the radar. At that moment, his expression remained unchanged. The naval fleet of 5 nations, 47 modern warships, and more than a dozen fighter squadrons. In his eyes, they didn't seem to exist. 10 kilometers. The first officer's eyes bulged out, staring at the distant sea. The veins on his arms were exposed as his palms were sweating profusely. The 2 destroyers, one after the other, were marching towards the border. At that moment, Lei Zheng suddenly raised his hand and fixed his cap. 5 kilometers. Almost as the first officer shouted out this sentence, Lei Zheng took off the radio on his shoulder. "All combat units, freely aim at all targets of the joint fleet except the aircraft carrier. Prepare." "Look, they changed course!" An exclamation interrupted his command. Lei Zheng's pupils shrank and fixed on the holographic screen. His eyes were filled with disbelief. The 2 destroyers at the forefront almost entered Zinn's territory. However, just 2 kilometers outside the border, they suddenly changed course and made a nearly 90-degree turn. Not just the 2 destroyers retreated, but the joint fleet behind them. Hill was crushed. Thoroughly crushed. She was a wise, strong, courageous, and tactical politician. Otherwise, she wouldn't have defeated her competitors to become the president. She had the best think tank, the best cabinet, but she lacked one thing: the spirit of a wolf. In this peaceful era, It wasn't a quality that could be selected. Fighting for social justice might help her gain votes, but that would never win a war for her. When the social justice warriors voted with joy and put the nuclear button in her hands, they trusted that she would never press the button to hell, but they never considered the consequence of the button never being able to be pressed. If nuclear deterrence didn't have a deterrence effect, could deterrence be called deterrence? At the moment when she looked into Jiang Qin's pupils, she felt that she was pulled out of her office and put into a coliseum. The opponent standing in front of her was neither a savvy politician nor a great leader but an outright lunatic, a fierce beast. Stop. At that moment, all the tricks, games, and even language had lost their effect. What ultimately broke down her psychological defense wasn't Jiang Qin's eyes nor was it his sentence, "Are you ready?" but the tens of millions of families on the other side of the world and the century-long prosperity of their country. It was the stakes in her hands that overwhelmed her. She must not let nuclear war break out. Stop. In the 10th second of the countdown before the nuclear war, she screamed and pushed away her suitcase, ran to the Minister of Defense, grabbed his collar, and shouted with full strength that the military exercise is now over, change course. History changed because of a word. The destroyers retreated. The joint fleet changed course. The nuclear button on the screen also disappeared. Staring at the emptiness on the screen, Hill gasped and took 2 steps back. The words seemed to sap out all the energy in her body. If it wasn't for the military advisor and the chief of staff holding her, she wasn't even sure if she could stand. After all, the war didn't break out. The strategy of returning to the Asia-Pacific and curbing Xin had now backfired along with The's hegemony. From now on, nothing could stop the expansion of the global power grid, and nothing could disintegrate the United Earth Defense Alliance. The entire world witnessed his retreat and the rise of Xin. Even the navy that had conquered the 7 seas and 5 oceans couldn't cross the boundary of one place, the Gate of Xin. 1127. There is no dignity between countries. Seagull-class transport ships could easily hijack military satellites in orbit, but it couldn't place cameras in Hill's office. Unfortunately, Jiang Qin could only hear the sound and couldn't see her last gaffe. When he turned off the camera, he closed the suitcase and pushed it to the side. Jiang Qin leaned back in the chair as he looked at the officer next to him who picked up the suitcase, then took a deep breath and slowly relaxed his tense muscles. Only he knew that his back was completely drenched. Just half a minute ago, he was prepared for the worst to happen. If the nuclear war broke out, his first step would be to take his relatives onto the space elevator, take the Seagull class to the lunar colony, wait for Lin Lin to invent interdimensional travel, then move his family to the apocalypse. As for this world, his only option would be to give it up. Fortunately, however, the person on the other side was wise. A wise person would never bet everything in a fight against a beast. Jiang Qin waved his hand to the officers next to him, gesturing for them to leave. After everyone left, only one person stayed. "Wipe your sweat off." Aisha walked next to Jiang Qin as she spoke softly, handing him a wet towel. "From today, will I be considered the most wanted terrorist in the eyes of the SIB?" Jiang Qin took the wet towel from Aisha's hand as he joked while he wiped his forehead. Like Bin Laden and Saddam, the cool feeling dispelled the heat that irritated him as his nervousness eased and subsided. Aisha held Jiang Qin's back and gently placed her chin on his shoulder. Her sapphire-like eyes blinked. "I will protect you." Her voice was quiet but resolute. Her words sneaked into his ear along with her warmth as they gently comforted his mind. While he was touched, Jiang Qin felt a bit strange being protected by his woman. He lifted his head, then looked at the holographic screen on the conference table. The joint fleet in the satellite image had just barely stopped on the border in front of Xin, and a conflict that almost became the fuse of a world war dissipated at the final moment. From beginning to end, Xin didn't compromise. In the next few days, Jiang Qin took a break. He bathed in the sun and relaxed on his private island. As for work, he completely pushed it aside for now. He also dragged Aisha and Ziyashu along, even if she was unwilling to leave her work, to explore everywhere. As for Natasha, who had only recently moved in, she immediately joined when she heard they were going on an adventure. Of course, While he relaxed, Zhang Chen still paid attention to what happened in the world. On the first day he left for the sea on his yacht, the Nippon representative came to Xin with its delegation and made an application to join the Earth Defense Alliance. It was ironic that just a few days ago, their warships were behind the aircraft carrier battle group. Now that the military exercise ended, they immediately took a drastically different stance. With this kind of shamelessness. Wait, no, choosing the right path. Of course Zhang Chen welcomed them wholeheartedly, but because he was still on vacation, he left the work to Zhang Yaping to handle. Is there dignity between countries? In a restaurant near Wall Street, Carrie and Daniel sat opposite of each other. They enjoyed their steak while they casually chatted about the dramatic changes that took place a few days ago. I said earlier that she's not a qualified leader. Oh, why do you say that? Daniel Morgan smiled as he cut the fattest, juiciest piece of meat with his knife. The courage to press the nuclear button is different from the willingness to press the nuclear button. See what she did? She pushed our nuclear button away. Oh God, since she didn't want it, then why did she choose it? Carrie cut the steak while muttering under his breath. He considered himself to have good etiquette. However, whenever he recalled Madam President's reaction that day, he always felt enraged. What if it was you? With a fork delivering the meat to his lips, Daniel Morgan's fork lingered in the air as he raised an eyebrow and asked with curiosity, Mr. Carey, what would you have done? I wouldn't have pressed the button. So, you would have given in? I wouldn't have given in. At noon on August 1st, 5 navies formed a joint fleet to begin the 2019 Asia-Pacific military exercise. When the exercise entered its second stage, because of frictions with the Xin naval fleet, the joint fleet was forced to divert. At present, the capital refuses to make a statement on this matter, but an official who doesn't wish to be named said, no matter how turbulent the Pacific Ocean was at the time, the news just casually made a few understatements, summarizing the hegemonic dispute that almost ignited the Third World War. The media all surprisingly shared the same tone on this incident, and there were no detailed reports on the friction. However, people could still sense the unusual state between the lines. In a villa complex, home to one of the richest men of the man with a clearly visible beer belly, laid on an extremely luxurious sofa while he sipped his whiskey. He was hugging a stunning model as he enjoyed the nightlife of the vibrant city. This TV talk show was one of his favorite shows. He loved the style of the host who made absurd statements. He even spent a lot of money to purchase this show, became its biggest sponsor, and placed his company's name in the most prominent place on the show. That's my show. Unabashedly teasing the beautiful woman in his arms, the man raised his hand holding the glass, pointed at the TV with his pinky, and said arrogantly, hotels, squares, retailers, mineral water plants, restaurants, bars, and even universities, golf courses, the internet, my companies are in the lives of Americans everywhere. The media is only a small part of it. The I can live without that bit H. But it absolutely can't live without me. Showing off was a great pleasure in life, especially to beautiful women. The blonde in his arms giggled, hugged his neck and gave him a kiss. Just then, the talk show talked about the recent changed course incident in the Western Pacific Ocean. In a very timely manner, the screen began to discuss the bit H he had just criticized. His drunken eyes glanced at the old woman on the screen, and an undisguised disdain appeared in his eyes. I said earlier that she's not a qualified president. If I became president. Burp. If I'm the president. The man suddenly turned his neck. Wait, speaking of this, I haven't been president yet. 1128. A heartfelt speech. For most Xin citizens, they only saw the shallowest representation of the confrontation in the Western Pacific. Celestial Trade fired warning shots and the joint fleet evaded. The fighters on both sides all took off and dueled it out in the air. In the end, both parties returned with no gains or losses. Of course, people who followed the situation still saw that Celestial Trade gained the upper hand. As for the game behind its appearance, no one dug deeper. In particular, both the Unzin tacitly remained silent regarding the duel between the leaders in front of the media. After all, The nuclear buttons were placed on the table. Jiang Chen didn't want to be labeled as a butcher by controversy, and the I didn't want to lose the deterrent known as the president's suitcase. The number of other countries who gained information about this through their intelligence networks was unpredictable. In any case, making the boss of the world change course was something worthy of pride. Celestial Trade Navy not only defended the sovereignty of Xin but it also the national honor and glory of the country. In the next week, the people of Xin walked in the streets with their heads held up high, almost to the point where they looked at people with their noses. Many immigrants from all over the world, from this very moment onward, truly regarded this new country as a nation. As for the public opinion showed polarization. The leftists praised Hill for her rationality. After all, the social justice warriors never agreed with the military exercise from the start. Xin's phantom helmets and high-tech products were so much fun. Why are they bullying her? In contrast, the right-wingers launched an attack on the weakness of the capital on social media, criticizing the government for bringing shame to the country. Even the commander of the Joint Fleet, Admiral Hogg, was targeted by this social media onslaught. Admiral Hogg was probably the most innocent individual in this whole fiasco. The Department of Defense gave him the mandate to take a tough stance, but the Department of Defense also made him retreat. He executed every order, yet now, he must take the blame with the bureaucrats. Dear heaven, how is this outcome related to him? Did he not sail his ship with a strong enough stance? The anger of the right-wingers not only filled the internet, it even flooded into the streets. With slogans held up high, they demonstrated in front of the Xin embassy. While these angry young people didn't smash every single new energy vehicle from Xin, they spontaneously joined to boycott Xin goods with the exception of two things: phantom helmet and medical drone. They could live without phones and robots, but without those two items, what would be the point of living? The economy was an extension of politics. The showdown in the Western Pacific Ocean already determined the situation today. However, although the anti-Xin sentiment in North America was growing, Future Group didn't seem too concerned. The global power grid along with the electricity evolution was starting to see its effect, and Future Group was now focusing on opening up the East Asian market. Take Shanghai as an example. Almost every parking lot was equipped with a wireless charging station. Charging could be completed by scanning a QR code with the phone without even needing to step out of the vehicle. The logistics drones replaced couriers, and robot mail was common in everyone's homes. Many electrical appliances that previously weren't practical due to high power consumption also become a reality. The Maglev Highway was the best example, although it was only popularized in Xin. Koro City already entered the 22nd century ahead of schedule, and Asia was advancing toward the 22nd world under the leadership of Xin. Regardless of everything else, a very intuitive phenomenon demonstrated the rapid changes in Asia. At night, overlooking the Earth from the geosynchronous orbit, it was easy to tell that the Asian region was much brighter than Europe and the Americas. In short, although hostility towards Xin created a certain impact on Future Group's market share in North America, the losses were quite limited, so Jiang Chen didn't consider it an area of concern. His foundation was the virtual reality network. And now, he had the addition of the global power grid. As long as these two initiatives remained untouched, Future Group would be unshakable. I have money, I'm rich, I'm very rich, so I don't care how much money the Wall Street will give me. I assure you that if you vote for me, at least your vote won't show up in the pockets of Wall Street. Only I can represent your interests, only I can represent the I dream. Yes. Only me. In a park in Nevada, people shouted frantically as they cheered and screamed. Countless arms were raised up, slogans of their support were held, flags were waving in the air as supporters repeatedly shouted the same name. The eyes of the man on stage were half narrowed, and his bright orange face had an arrogant and undisguised smile. He opened his arms and accepted the cheers of the voters with his chin. But he gained a respect that other candidates couldn't receive from bending down. He knew what they needed the most, and what they needed was exactly what he could give. Choosing the right time to raise his hand and signal everyone to listen, The man fixed the microphone and waved his index finger while speaking with the greatest strength of his life. We shouldn't send Gary, someone who has no idea how to negotiate at all. He will sign a laughable and irritating agreement with them. Watch them use our money to make weapons and act aggressively on the negotiating table. You know who I'm talking about? That's right, it's him. The person who can match him can only be a man manlier than him, not an old woman without a proper menstrual cycle. Tell me, will you vote for that old lady? The expressions of many female voters suddenly changed and they immediately lost interest. They not only smashed the signs they held, but they also raised their middle fingers and booed. But the cheers under the stage grew even louder, drowning out their booing amidst the tide of cheers. They were fed up with being politically correct and fed up with politicians who only made empty promises. Now, someone finally stood up, even if he might not necessarily be smart enough. Considering what he just said, he shared the same perspective as many who stood there. The dream has been shattered. I will reshape the dream, make it bigger, better, stronger, and allow it to return to greatness. Thank you. The man bowed down and stepped down from the podium amidst thunderous cheers. No one noticed this impassioned election speech, and no one even noticed this insignificant candidate. Hill was still busy dealing with the aftermath of the event as she desperately tried to reunite the allies that started to pull apart. Accompanied by Daniel Morgan, Kerry collected evidence of scandal of a particular person and frequently contacted members of the party. He quietly prepared for the election in the coming year and prepared to strike his big boss at the perfect time. 1129 The unlucky Gishida. Koro City. At Zhang Chen's mansion door. The weather is nice today. Yeah, the weather is good. Gishida's face squeezed into a smile. Without giving an opportunity for Zhang Chen to change the topic, he quickly showed Zhang Chen a document. What do you think? We've already joined the Earth Defense Alliance, so the defense tax. Haha, of course. Zhang Chen, who just came back from Coconut Island, laughed and patted Gishida's slim shoulder. Zhang Chen reached for his pocket then looked around before his expression became disappointed. You see, I don't have a pen. Why don't you just leave the document here and I will send it to you after I'm done with it? No need, no need. I have a pen here. Gishida immediately reached into his pocket and took out a pen. He then handed it to Zhang Chen with a smile. You can have the pen, so now you can sign it. HMPH. Gishida pretended not to hear the sound as he continued to gaze at Zhang Chen with a smile on his face. He was prepared to stay there until the document was signed. Since Nippon joined the Earth Defense Alliance, Nippon completely got on the wrong side of so it changed its diplomatic stance and began to lean towards Sin. The previous territorial and historical issues were no longer topics of discussion. However, when Gishida happily went to Zhang Chen with the defense tax agreement, he couldn't find Zhang Chen anymore. That's right, Zhang Chen disappeared. This made him extremely anxious and paranoid. First, he didn't expect Zhang Chen to be such a rogue. Second, the defense tax costed Nippon more than $1 billion per day, which meant he couldn't wait any longer. Despite being an influential diplomat, he turned into a paparazzi and waited around Zhang Chen's mansion all day long. Fortunately, after waiting for a week, Zhang Chen, who just came back from the apocalypse, finally showed up. Since Zhang Chen couldn't find any excuses, he sighed and unwillingly picked up the pen. But right then, his eyes suddenly lit up. He looked at Gishida and coughed. I suddenly remembered that today is Saturday, not a working day. As soon as Gishida heard Zhang Chen making another excuse, he couldn't stand this anymore. His eyes stared straight at Zhang Chen with a tragic look. Mr. Zhang, please don't joke with me anymore. I know you've been hiding from me all these days, but we joined the Earth Defense Alliance. In other words, we're now comrades inside the same trench. Why are you giving us trouble? If you're angry with the joint military exercise, I can apologize. I just hope you can relinquish the past and treat us equally. But your apology is worth nothing. Of course, Zhang Chen also thought about this. If he really said it, it would damage the relationship between his allies. Since Nippon already joined them, he should relinquish the past. Haha, Mr. Gishida, I'm not that type of person. Zhang Chen held onto his arm. "I wouldn't make you apologize." Zhang Chen picked up the pen again, and under the staring of the Mungbin-like eyes, he signed his name at the bottom of the document. After Kishida accepted the signed documents, he repeatedly praised and thanked Zhang Chen. He thanked but refused Zhang Chen's invitation for a few drinks and immediately left. Even with the documents signed, it would still take a few days to lift the defense tax. Any wasted time now meant wasted money. After Zhang Sen sent off the foreign minister of Nippon, he returned inside. As he walked past the entrance, he saw Natasha holding a bottle of champagne in her hand and relaxingly enjoyed the pleasant afternoon. "What's the matter? Did you lose money?" Looking at Zhang Chen, Natasha whistled at him and teased, "I did lose money." Zhang Chen was very honest and nodded. Not only did he lose money, but he lost a lot of money. The idea of the few billion flying away pained him. If he knew better, he would have returned a few days later from the apocalypse, although the money wouldn't end up in his pocket. "It's fine, you're rich." Natasha gulped down a sip of champagne and let out a short burp. She rolled her eyes as she said, "It's not like you need that money to survive. Drinking during the day, aren't you afraid of getting fat?" Zhang Chen mimicked her and rolled his eyes too. "Are you? Obviously, you don't seem to mind." Natasha snorted, giggled, and raised her chest. "I like it there, but not here." Zhang Chen pretended to be ferocious. Not only did Natasha not show any fear, but with a grin, she raised an eyebrow, provoking him. "I only gain fat there. Try it yourself." "Try? I'll try it." Since they were the only ones at home, Zhang Chen had nothing to worry about. He turned into a big bad wolf and leaped at her. Well, Natasha didn't lie. Zhang Chen could swear that all her fat shifted to her chest. Even if it was said that Slavs were prone to beer bellies, she somehow managed to maintain her great figure. Her well-proportioned vest line on her lower abdomen was more addictive to touch than her chest. After they messed around for a bit, Zhang Chen finally let go of the exhausted Natasha while breathing heavily. He thought she would have to nap for a bit, but she unexpectedly turned over and her fatigue instantly disappeared. Her two fit legs pinched Zhang Chen's waist as she pushed him down, then she tightened her legs and rode on his lower abdomen. Too deceiving. It turned out that she faked everything. But since he did everything he wanted to, he'd let her freely dominate for a moment. Zhang Chen let the proud Natasha ride him to regain her confidence as a former agent. "To be honest, sometimes I really can't understand you." Natasha's finger circled Zhang Chen's chest as her witty sapphire eyes cast a lethargic vibe and examined Zhang Chen top to bottom. "Sometimes, I feel like you're a vulgar businessman who couldn't be any more vulgar and you always talk about interests. But sometimes, you don't play by the rules and do something completely outside common sense. Not to mention you, even I can't understand myself." Zhang Chen's eyes gazed into the pair of sapphires and he suddenly let out a hopeless sigh. "I could just be a landlord who rules a couple plots of land, so why should I bother with so much?" Maybe by the time Harmony's space colonization ship arrives, Superman, Spider-Man would all appear and I wouldn't need to worry about all this. "What are you talking about? How come I don't understand?" For a moment, Natasha didn't understand Zhang Chen's sudden spontaneous change of topic. She looked at him and said, "But if the extraterrestrial civilization really comes, even if you want to protect your land as a landlord, you won't have the chance?" "That depends." Zhang Chen shrugged and didn't explain further. A century would be more than enough for Lin Lin to invent interdimensional travel technology. At that time, he could just take his family to the apocalypse, and the Harmony civilization wouldn't be able to find him at all. Of course, this would be the last resort. 1130 Welcoming Ceremony. August 13th, sunny. Wang Qian wrote the date on the header, then he gazed out at the endless sand outside of the window. He let out a sigh and closed his diary. There was no beauty here. It was barren everywhere. Sand was the only scenery. The uninteresting view and boring life made it difficult even to search for a few hundred words for his diary. But it was fine, or how else would he kill his spare time? When he looked up at the wall clock on the wall, it was about time. Wang Qiang stuffed the diary into the drawer and headed out. When he walked through the corridor, He couldn't see a soul. No matter how vast Mars was, it was a relatively closed environment for the 20 colonists living there. After work, everyone returned to their rooms and closed themselves in their closed circles. Some put on phantom helmets while others dazed in front of a book. Sometimes Wang Qiang even wondered if the kitchen could be equipped with a drone. Perhaps he wouldn't ever see his neighbors for the rest of his life? A closed environment tended to breed more psychological disorders. More and more people began seeing the psychologist, and the psychologist was becoming busier and busier to the point that his schedule was always filled. It was even to the point that the only psychologist in the colony almost became depressed due to his heavy workload. But Wang Qiang fared okay with his diary, a friend who occasionally played pool with him, and a not-so-boring job. After he rinsed in the washroom, he took out his equipment from the closet. After he put on his gear, he went through the buffer room and the air shower room before he headed outside. His boots sank into the sand, and the dim light scattered through the cracks in the dust. Wang Qiang raised his head and narrowed his eyes slightly as he looked at the murky Sunday. Just as he walked to the rover, a communication window popped out on the lower right corner of the holographic screen inside his helmet. When he pressed the bottom, it was the captain's voice. Today's mission is cancelled. Drive the rover back to the garage and immediately gather at Central Square. Wang Qiang, inexplicably confused, asked, "What happened?" "The reinforcements are here. The reinforcements are here." When Wang Qiang heard the 4 short words, his heart was overwhelmed with uncontrollable joy. It was like a drought had lasted for 3 years and the rain finally arrived. He eagerly hopped onto the rover and parked the rover into the garage. Without stopping for a second, he jogged to the Central Square. When he crossed through the gate, he found that the remaining 19 colonists had all arrived. Captain Hong Zhuai stood in the middle of the square, and he read a stack of papers in his hand. The rest of the people were beside him, all listening carefully. Everyone was full of excitement which oozed from the bottoms of their hearts. Reinforcements finally arrived. Wang Qiang pulled his friend and whispered, "What is the captain reading?" "The letters from Earth." The friend said, overjoyed. "Celestial Trade built a column for us and collected about 10,000 greetings from Earth." "Are you sure you received greetings?" Wang Qiang asked strangely. Considering the etiquette of the internet, he didn't believe they were greetings at all. Ahem, of course, all of them were screened. There were over 10,000 letters in total. "How can we read them?" The friend looked at Wang Qiang with an expression that said you only need to know, then continued to look at the stack of letters in Hong Zhuai's hands. Wang Qiang was truly touched by the envelopes. At least the people on Earth still remembered the Martians. The words of longing made him think of the blue planet, the magnificent sea, and palm leaves swaying in front of his door. Sniffing his nose, Wang Qiang suddenly remembered the cancelled mission for today and why it was cancelled. So he immediately looked around, but he was surrounded by familiar faces. "Didn't you say that the reinforcements were here? Where are they?" The letters were brought by the reinforcements and thrown down from the synchronized orbit. The friend grinned and pointed his finger at the sky. "It's almost time." Wang Qiang looked up and looked beyond the transparent graphene dome above the Central Square. "Let us welcome our new friends, the second group of colonists." Loud cheers filled the square. People popped open the champagne and let the liquid freely ooze. Since the day of the landing, a long time had passed since he heard this kind of euphoric cheer. Wang Qiang had zoned out as he didn't hear what Hong Zhuai said anymore. His eyes were stuck on the turbid sky until the blue light particles appeared. They began to gather, turn brighter, and finally reveal the shape they carried. The rectangular colonial cabin looked like a stone monument on its side. The shape design inherited the consistent style of future heavy industries shipyard. It was dropped from the synchronous orbit by the TS Seagull, with the plasma engine reducing its speed to land. It landed beside the colony. A muffled sound that hit the ground came underneath their feet. The base of the colonial cabin was deeply embedded in the sand, creating a gust of wind and sand. After the first colonial cabin landed, Celestial Trade made a second footprint on Mars after just a few months. Although the cabin carried a total of 110 people, The new landing cabin was much smaller than the original colonial cabin. The newly launched cabin contained only the tools and materials that the new colonists and the colonies desperately needed. It didn't contain reserved living spaces or a functional cabin with a production workshop. 10 bus-shaped rovers came out from the side of the colonial cabin that carried more than 100 colonists from Earth. Among the colonists were engineers who had worked in lunar colony, technicians who specialized in industrial automation design, even chefs with the goal of improving the dining choice at the colony, or musicians who decided to devote their lives. In addition to these ordinary colonists, there were 10 special people. They were soldiers belonging to the Orbital Airborne Brigade of Celestial Trade. Nominally, they were sent to maintain the security of the colony, but in fact, they came for the secret 5 kilometers underground. The colonial garage opened, and the large rovers rolled in. The old colonists prepared a grand welcoming ceremony for their new neighbors from afar. It had been a long time since the colony was so lively, so the welcoming ceremony was particularly grand. It wasn't long before everyone was greeted in the cafeteria. All kinds of food and wine were brought to the table, and the captain, Hong Zhuai, gave a toast to start the beginning of the celebrations. The welcoming ceremony boosted the low morale of the colony. After 5 bottles of champagne, Wang Qiang burped, tipsy, and his eyes drifted with swinging consciousness. At that moment, he suddenly noticed that in the inconspicuous corner of the banquet, a man walked to the captain, saluted, and seemed to say something. As for the specifics, he was too drunk to figure them out. A friend gave him a shot of whiskey and Wang Qiang felt his world turning. Finally, his forehead made intimate contact with the table before his consciousness fell into the abyss. This was probably his happiest moment since he came to Mars. 1131 Land reclamation, farming, and steelmaking. After the arrival of the new colonists, the construction of the Mars colony also entered the second stage. Celestial Trade had a clear position of the Mars colony as the solar system industrial base from the beginning, so the development direction of the second stage of the colony had been quite clear. The focus was mining, and steelmaking. Steel was the foundation of industry. To produce on Mars, steel production must keep up. It wasn't difficult to achieve this on Mars. It was possible to smell rust when one bent down and grabbed a handful of sand. It was just a matter of the amount that was the concern. Also, the development of heavy industry had the added benefit of artificially causing a greenhouse effect that would indirectly change Mars' atmospheric thickness. Perhaps after a few centuries, the atmospheric thickness of Mars might return to the levels 3 billion years ago with human intervention and become the second paradise of mankind. Of course, this was an afterthought. In addition to increasing production capacity, the population must keep increasing. The labor force was always one of the important factors that restricted industrial development, whether it was the general labor force or educated labor force. Even if automated production could drastically reduce the demand for uneducated labor in industrial facilities, it was unlikely to completely depend on an autonomous process. Impossible for at least 2 centuries. In the half-year plan for the Mars colony, Zhang Chen clearly defined 2 goals. The first was that the monthly output of steel must exceed 1 million tons. The second was to expand the size of the colony to 1,000 people. For this reason, the new colonists who arrived on Mars didn't have time to enjoy the exoticness on Mars. The next day, they had to drag their alcohol-intoxicated bodies to work. This Seagull-class transport ship not only brought the colonists, but also brought many production tools such as excavators, cranes, and mining equipment designed for the Mars environment. The original colonial cabin with the square could only provide 200 living units, and the colonists who arrived later could only live in the rooms they built. After all, a colonial cabin that could be deployed by airdrops was quite expensive, and it would be impossible for Celestial Trade to waste all of their budget on buying houses for the colonists. All the engineers at the colony started to share the same schedule as they commanded the construction workers to operate construction vehicles. The entire colony turned into a giant construction site, submerged in flying dust. The first to start the expansion was the soilless cultivation farm, then the spherical water pump, followed by the steel mill. Just as the construction machines were working on the sand dunes, an armored car that had been specially modified for the Mars environment left from the garage and went to the distant horizon. Celestial City, Space Command Center, Mars Colonization Project Department. After learning that the transport ship arrived on Mars, Zhang Chen arrived by space elevator at his earliest opportunity. He found Calvin, who was performing an inspection in the command center, and asked him about the current situation of the Mars colony. Our colonists landed safely. They landed yesterday. Calvin nodded. The Seagull-class transport ship escaped Mars gravity after a week in the synchronous orbit and is now returning to the Earth-Moon system. The colony is moving in the right direction. Zhang Chen nodded with satisfaction. Then he asked about another item he was concerned about. What about Mino 71? Do we have an update? It's not this quick of a process. Kelvin shook his head. Our Marines just departed from the colony and haven't yet reached the mine. Even if they arrived, we can't immediately obtain information 5 kilometers below. According to the solution provided by Hong Zhuai, we will first drill a 5-kilometer deep well at Mine 071, then insert a drone to scope out the underground environment. Zhang Chen asked, "What do you think is there?" Kelvin shook his head helplessly. "I don't know. Maybe it's really an alien city. But I hope it's the grave of an alien or a fossil. If there are living Martians, then it will absolutely be a disaster for our colony." Zhang Chen didn't know if it would be a blessing or curse to discover relics of aliens. On the one hand, he was excited to see what the colonists could discover, but on the other, he was worried if this would bring disaster to the Mars colony. Just when Zhang Chen felt conflicted, he suddenly remembered that maybe someone could give him the answer. With a stomach full of questions, he took the space elevator back to the ground the next day. Koro University. Unlike third-rate universities not much better than community colleges, Koro University was now a world-class institution. Whether in academia or enterprise, the university began to grow its sphere of influence. Of course, their influence was mainly reflected in studies of aerospace, new energy, and materials science. As for other professions, they weren't worth mentioning. When the university was first established, Zhang Chen promised the dean to teach an elective course called cosmology. It also satisfied his desire to become a university professor. But since he pulled Hawking from his wheelchair, his short-lived interest disappeared and he gave the job to Hawking. On the shadowy path among the tall trees, many naive faces traversed between classes. Students with different skin colors chatted with their friends talking about girls, clubs, professors, where to chill next. Because it was a Saturday, the campus was quieter than normal. Whenever this happened, the students often chose to take a stroll in the downtown area or buy boat tickets for a day trip to Penglai City. Only hardworking students or students taking public electives stayed in the building. Zhang Chen quietly visited the campus without catching any attention. He made a phone call with Raphael Leaf and learned that Hawking was in class, so he drove straight to the school building. After waiting for the class to end, Zhang Chen found Hawking, who had just exited the auditorium. Hawking was surprised by the unexpected visitor as he paused. A rare guest. Zhang Chen made a helpless expression. He was about to speak before Hawking said first, "I guess you have something to ask me?" This time, Zhang Chen paused. He didn't expect the genius Hawking to have the ability to read minds. "Yes. There's a small problem at work. I don't know if this is a convenient time for you." "Of course, if it's inconvenient. I don't know how many scholars would be more than willing to have the opportunity to answer questions from the president," Hawking said good-naturedly, pulling Zhang Chen to the side. "It's lunchtime, so let's talk as we go. The cafeteria at the East Building is quite good. The pancakes there are delicious. I highly recommend them." Now that class was over, many students noticed the two people at the door. After they recognized Zhang Chen, some people even took out their phones. He would be surrounded. Zhang Chen didn't have time to learn about the enthusiasm of university students for the time being, so he quickly followed Hawking and left the building. 1132 Fermi's paradox and the Great Filter. Although already well into his 70s, mature wasn't the right word to describe the old man. His posture and the habit of looking around reflected the shadow of a 16-year-old teen. However, Jiang Chen quickly made sense of it. He asked himself if he sat in a while for a few decades, he would probably be more lively. Just as Jiang Chen examined the old man from behind, Hawking turned his head and teased him. "So, Mr. President, if you have any questions, please ask me soon. You are an important man making hundreds of thousands of dollars per second. You shouldn't waste too much time on campus." Jiang Chen laughed without denying the statement. After a moment of thought, he asked, 3.7 billion years. If you think there are civilizations that existed for 3.7 billion years, what would they develop into? This is a very interesting question. What do you think dinosaurs would have evolved to if they had 100 million years? Hawking did not directly answer Jiang Chen's question, but instead gave him another question. Can you consider dinosaurs a civilization? Jiang Chen asked. Are ants considered a civilization then? Are the bees civilized? Do the birds in the sky have their own society? Maybe there are and they do, but we just can't understand, or have never considered them in these perspectives. Hawking shrugged. Arrogance is one attribute that belongs to a civilization. Those who are weaker than us become slaves, those even weaker become food, and those not even considered food are regarded as bugs. Hawking suddenly grinned when he made this statement. We are very fortunate that at least our civilization has caught the attention of our neighbors. We didn't get ignored by them as dispensable bugs. You call this fortunate? Jiang Chen smiled bitterly. Rather than those bugs sailing 20.5 light-years to take his life, he would much rather those bugs consider him as a bug too. Of course it is considered fortunate. The Indians have at least a chance to fight back against the European colonists, but do the bugs have that chance? Stop. Look, you almost trampled the little life. Hawking stopped Jiang Chen. In Jiang Chen's peculiar gaze, Hawking pointed to his feet. That's right. I'm talking about that ant. If I didn't remind you, you wouldn't have even noticed. You won't communicate with it, and you won't care what it thinks, and less about whether they have had a technological breakthrough in the nesting process. Hawking with a smile crouched down, picked up a branch, and placed it in front of the ant. The little ant was confused by the sudden obstacle. The tentacles on its head swayed back and forth, and finally chose to go around from the side. We are taught a lot of common sense in our life, but common sense is often just synonymous with prejudice. Hawking turned his head and looked at Jiang Chen. Do you think it will think about why this branch is in front of it? Do you think I should answer this question from a philosophical point of view, or from a scientific point of view? Jiang Chen said in a helpless tone. I am not an ant. How would I know whether it will know why this branch is in front of it? Hawking laughed. He turned his head back and looked at the ant who walked around the branches, then he continued. It has nothing to do with philosophy or science. If you have to put a name on it, it should be cosmology. Jiang Chen twitched. Cosmology? Yes, the definition of cosmology is the study of the universe as a whole and extends to the discussion of human status in the universe. It cannot be considered philosophy, and it is certainly not science. However, it is related to both subjects. Hawking reached out and picked up the two branches, blocking the two sides of the ant, and surrounded it. If you came an hour earlier, you would be sitting in the classroom and listening to the story of Fermi's paradox, 1, and the Great Filter, 2. But unfortunately, you missed the lively and interesting public elective course. However, it's still not too late if you treat me with pancakes. No problem. As much as you want, Jiang Chen quickly replied. Hawking smiled and pointed to the triangular cage on the ground that he made with branches. The masterpiece he spent 3 seconds completing. This branch is the Great Filter it faces. If it goes around, then it will survive. If it figures it out, it will become a different ant. If it is blocked. After a pause, Hawking stood up slowly and patted away the dust on his clothes. It will starve to death here. Jiang Chen frowned after Hawking's words. Suddenly, like a eureka moment, he said thoughtfully, Fermi's paradox, the Great Filter. As if he just caught something, Zhang Chen's eyes gradually brightened. At this moment, he noticed that the ant extended its tentacles to the branches. Trapped in the triangle cage, it could not find a way out. Then, it began to explore another method, as it climbed on top of the branches. However, from beginning to end, it was not aware of who manipulated the obstacle placed in front of it. Now I'll answer your question. You asked me how developed civilization will be after 3.7 billion years. I can't answer you unless you can tell me what they have encountered in these 3.7 billion years. On the scale of billion, the troubles are always endless. Natural disasters, diseases, wars. In fact, these are minor problems. Like this branch. No matter how many more branches are placed in front of it, it will eventually pass them. Hawking smiled as he looked at the ant who had successfully climbed over the branch. Of course, it is not always so lucky, especially if it encounters a moody god. Hawking raised his foot and stomped down on the ant and the branches. After chatting with Hawking, Zhang Chen felt that he gained clarity over a lot of problems, not only about the civilization 3.7 billion years ago, but also the extraterrestrial civilization 20 light-years away. He managed to find the answers to all the questions he was uncertain or unsure about. After arriving at the cafeteria, as promised, Zhang Chen treated Hawking to 2 sets of pancakes. To be honest, he really didn't understand the appeal of this food that is too sweet. But the old man across from him enjoyed it nonetheless. He could only attribute it to the difference in food culture. In the principle of not wasting food, Zhang Chen had to dismember the pancake in his plate and finish the meal. He certainly miscalculated. He didn't account for the fact that Hawking came from the United Kingdom, the pioneer of the art of dark cuisine. 3. You don't have to force yourself to eat it, Hawking said with a smirk as he put another piece of pancake in his mouth. It was obvious he was trying his hardest not to laugh as his wrinkles twisted together. Zhang Chen suddenly felt that the old man's smile was too infuriating. I'm full. Zhang Chen tossed his fork into the plate as he finally gave up on the pancake with more than half left. After he bid farewell with Hawking, he returned his car. Because he parked at the building, he had to return the same way. However, as he passed through the forest path again, he found a group of students gathered together around a temporary podium that looked extremely lively. Out of curiosity, Zhang Chen stopped a passing student, pointed to the other side, and asked, "What are they doing there?" 1. Fermi's paradox. The Fermi paradox, or Fermi's paradox, named after physicist Enrico Fermi, is the apparent contradiction between the lack of evidence and high probability estimates for the existence of extraterrestrial civilizations. Source: Wikipedia. 2. The Great Filter, in the context of the Fermi paradox, is whatever prevents dead matter from undergoing abiogenesis, in time, to expanding lasting life as measured by the Kardashev scale. Source: Wikipedia. 3. Dark cuisine, a term in Chinese pop culture that refers to an untraditional method of cooking that produces odd or weird food. Chapter 1133. The Security Treaty in Jeopardy. Oh, them. The student looked at Zhang Chen with a weird expression. He only thought that the person in front of him looked familiar, but he couldn't tell where he had seen him before. They are probably just pulling for a political party for the upcoming election. There have been more and more of these activities recently. Zhang Chen nodded. Almost 4 years had passed since he overthrew President Edward's regime. In the past 4 years, the changes in Koro Island could be described as groundbreaking. There were almost no traces of the small fishing village. Xin implemented a presidential system with 4 years between each election, and the election campaign was set to begin at the end of March next year. If everything goes smoothly, Zhang Yaping was expected to continue his presidency, and Celestial Grade would continue to be the behind-the-scene ruler of the country. The parties would symbolically compete for the position of president, and then focus their efforts on the parliamentary seats. As a revolution that saved the people, it was almost impossible for Zhang Yaping to lose the election with the backing of Celestial Trade unless Zhang Yaping decided to voluntarily withdraw from the election. At this moment, Zhang Chen suddenly remembered something. The election, which always attracted worldwide attention, seemed to be next year too. After what happened in the latter half of this year, it was difficult for Hill to be re-elected. It was difficult for her to seek agreement in her own party, let alone gain the support of the people. When he thought of this, Jiang Qin couldn't help but smile. God bless Xin. I hope they will choose a more foolish opponent for me next year. Jiang Chen guessed right. It was indeed a difficult time for Hill. The aircraft carrier battle group had never turned around because of the threat of any country. What's more, it was only a small country with a navy of 6 frigates and 30 fighters. Except for those who stood in the Pentagon's combat command room that day, everyone blamed this incident on Hill's weak diplomatic strategy. Even Hill's public relations team released some inside information and said that the Madam President was against a lunatic who was not afraid to launch a nuclear war, but obviously not many people bought the story. Nuclear deterrence. Deterrence. How did you know that he was not bluffing? How are you sure that he dared to press the button? Hillary really didn't know, but she couldn't bet the country's future on whether the 10 seconds after would be heaven or hell. Although many people put themselves in her shoes and thought they couldn't do any better, it didn't stop them from attacking her. This was politics. On Saturday, Hill was in the president's office, listening to the FBA director's report. At this moment, the office door was pushed open, and the FBA director immediately stopped and took 2 steps back. When she saw the person standing at the door, Hill frowned. You forgot to knock on the door, Mr. Bolden. I will apologize for my rudeness, but please wait until I have finished speaking. The second group of colonists from Celestial Trade has reached Mars. We have lost to them on the Moon and the gaps are growing wider and wider on Mars. He walked in the door anxiously as he placed a document on Hill's desk. He looked at her seriously and said, NASA needs a bigger budget. If you still want us to build a space elevator before 2050. Hill rubbed the wrinkles at the corner of her eyes. You should discuss this with the Congress, not come to me. With a bitter smile, Bolden shook his head. Those short-sighted people are losing faith in Silicon Valley and Seattle. I have written 2 plans, but they are all stuck with the budget committee. You're my last resort. I apologize for being rude. After Bolden carefully finished his speech, he left from the office. What are the people in Congress thinking? Hill frowned. She buried her face between her palms and took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment, and looked at the FBA director standing next to her. Help me find out who it is. Hill's words shocked the FBA director as he quickly waved his hands. This is not in compliance. I won't help you investigate members of Congress. I think someone is behind the scenes, Hill said expressionlessly. Someone was lobbying the budget committee to stop government funding. The Minister of Defense asked me to talk about similar issues in the morning. This situation was very common. In order to achieve political goals, certain groups or companies often pressured the Capitol through Congress, and the Budget Committee was only one of the means. For example, the famous K Street between Capitol Hill and the Capitol was a reflection of this phenomenon. It could be regarded as the gray area of the democratic system. Hill's words made the FBA director hesitate for a moment, then he reluctantly nodded. At best, I can help you keep an eye on who those hearing committee members have been with these days. Just then, the door was pushed open again. Hill suddenly became angry. That's enough. Don't you guys know how to knock on the door? Sorry, I'm really in a hurry. While Carrie apologized, he quickly walked in and took out the documents under his arm. Then he placed it on her desk with an anxious expression. Nippon announced that it has joined the Earth Defense Alliance. Our people have just confirmed this news. Hill raised an eyebrow. Just confirmed? What is the SIB doing? They were very careful. Their Congress has not even discussed this matter publicly. It's not within the rules. It's not the first time they didn't follow the rules. Asian countries are all like this. Kerry couldn't refrain himself from cussing out. The cabinet bypassed Congress and made a decision. It was indeed not the first time Nippon has done such a thing. It was just that the last time this happened was for the benefit of the and this time it was to prevent the from knowing. After a pause, Kerry continued with an awkward expression. The thing that worries us the most still has happened. They are now rediscussing the security treaty with us. How dare they? Hill suddenly felt a chill down her spine. The legal basis for the troops stationed in Nippon was the Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security between the and Nippon signed on January 9, 1960, which renewed every 10-year period, after which it can be abolished by either party with a 1-year notice. After the expiry of the term in 1970, the two countries did not announce the abolition but automatically extended it to this day. Today, the military forces stationed in East Asia were no longer supervising the defeated countries in World War II but were there to achieve the Eurasia-Pacific strategy. Nippon's willingness to be the pawn of the was also an attempt to use its influence as protection for outward expansion. It was also the fundamental reason why neither party has mentioned the termination of the treaty for more than 40 years. In order to retain the troops, the Nippon government paid $5.2 billion each year despite the anger that brewed in the people. However, since the T-virus incident and since Prime Minister Abe was forced to step down, the right-wing forces were in a slump. Now the rise of Zen and the development of outer space resources completely eliminated Nippon's goal of outward expansion, and so, they completely embraced the Earth Defense Alliance. In this way, keeping the garrison in Nippon went from a mutually beneficial relationship to us wishful thinking. While Nippon mentioned that it would rediscuss the treaty, it was likely just a ploy to remove the military from its soil. If the weak performance of the Joint Fleet in the Western Pacific only slightly weakened Hill's approval rate, then the loss of the Nippon military base would become an unerasable stain in her political career. This time, Hillary really started to panic. Chapter 1134 Code Name 007 Future Building, Koro City. They were still in the conference room, but this time Mr. Kishida did not bring his delegation. He came alone. Zhang Chen's assistant poured 2 cups of tea for the two and then exited out of the meeting room. According to your request, we are discussing reducing the military budget for troops stationed in Nippon, Kishida politely said after looking at the door and confirmed that there was no one else in the room. Although the purpose of the Earth Defense Alliance was aimed at extraterrestrial civilization, it was ultimately a form of military alliance. Since Nippon joined the Earth Defense Alliance, it naturally should not accept the garrison of other military bodies. Since they were all in the same trench, they couldn't wear the same pants as someone from another trench. After he discussed this matter with leaders from Han and Russia, Zhang Chen agreed that the issue of troops stationed in Nippon should be resolved. Reducing? Why not just cut the budget? Zhang Chen smiled, sipped on the tea, and said, "Do you still want them?" "Not at all." Kishida's eyes turned bigger as he rushed to explain, "It's just that after all, they are at our doorstep and we are afraid of aggravating them." What's the saying? Boiling the frog with warm water. He certainly changed his stance quickly over the past few weeks. Zhang Chen looked at Kishida describing everything in a vivid voice and faked a smile. Although the saying is indeed right, the frog will still jump out once the water is too hot. Abolishing the security treaty, or slowly forcing the troops to withdraw by reducing their budget are essentially no different to the just as how 80 degrees or 100 degrees water will still burn the frog. But for Nippon, there was a big difference. Although the military that had yet to withdraw is troublesome, on the other hand, it could also be considered a bargaining chip in their hands to exchange for certain benefits. For example, they could negotiate for an additional asteroid at the negotiating table and win more projects for their domestic aerospace companies. Zhang Chen never expected Nippon to fully commit to the Earth Defense Alliance. It was expected that they planned to use this as leverage, and the other member states all shared the same perspective. It was already a not-so-secret conspiracy. While it was obvious, as long as their request remained reasonable, Zhang Chen didn't mind. A small step back would be worth it for the countries still on the sideline. They already drunk 2 cups of tea. Kishida quietly glanced at the time. He sensed the opportunity was right and smiled. If by that time, don't worry, if they're still there, I will kick them out myself. Zhang Chen waved his hand with certainty. The smile on Kishida was extremely bright. Zhang Chen didn't know if it was fake or from the bottom of his heart. "Thank you." After Zhang Chen sent Kishida away, He returned to his office on the top floor. He took the coffee from the beautiful assistant and sank into his chair. He then opened his holographic screen and began reading each company department's report. He didn't even finish 1/4 of the coffee before Aisha came in. She stood behind Zhang Chen as her two small hands habitually rested on top of his shoulders and began to massage them. "The task you have given me has been completed." "This quickly?" Zhang Chen said, surprised. A rare smile belonging to a girl formed on Aisha's face. Zhang Chen's surprise was an affirmation for her, or a good reward. She quickly hid her smile and returned to her emotionless state. Then she reported, "According to the intelligence we have gathered, the SIB's penetration of Nippon has reached an alarming level. There is enough evidence to prove that at least 51 members of the Senate and the House of Representatives are directly or indirectly related to the SIB. That many. It seems that the political scene of the country has become ill." Zhang Chen was shocked by the figure. It is no wonder that before Kishida reached an agreement with Zhang Chen, he stayed in Xin. It was because he did not dare to go back. "Yes, it's already ill." Aisha nodded with certainty. Since the Cold War, the AI never ceased its intelligence operation in Nippon. It continued to support pro-AI candidates to maintain their influence. Roger Hilsman, who served as Deputy Secretary of State during the previous administration, said that until the early 1960s, the SIB provided funding to politicians. Although all activities were carried out in secret, espionage became a vital part of foreign policy in Nippon. With the financial assistance of the SIB, some unknown and young politicians became influential members of the country. This included a former deputy prime minister that denied he received financial support but admitted that he was closely related to SIB. Since the showdown on the Pacific Ocean, Zhang Chen issued an order to the Intelligence Department to expand the number of agents in Nippon and set up a larger intelligence network to remove foreign intelligence networks. It must be mentioned here that the Intelligence Department of Xin is divided into two systems. One was the Xin National Intelligence Agency under the jurisdiction of Celestial Trade Armed Forces. It was an administrative institution of the company. The other was the Ghost Agents directly loyal to Zhang Chen. The former was mainly engaged in the collection of international intelligence and national counterespionage work. The latter not only served part of the functions of the former, but the latter also engaged in espionage activities such as assassinating dangerous targets that must remain in the dark. Simply put, the former was the eye while the latter was the dagger. Aisha's focus for the past was to integrate the power of the eye and the dagger with the goal of forming Xin's own intelligence network in Nippon. Now with the eye and the dagger already in place, with just one order from Zhang Chen place, they could remove any foreign intelligence network on the island and become the new master. He leaned back, then looked at Aisha. "Do you think the SIB is aware of our actions?" "They are aware." Aisha gently rubbed her hands on Zhang Chen's cheek. "They have already begun to move. According to the intelligence from Nippon, they are forging scandal documents of the Prime Minister. Within 2 months, the current Prime Minister will be ousted. The code of the mission is closing plan, and the ultimate goal is to elect a pro-AI cabinet." "Closing plan?" Zhang Chen smiled, intrigued. "This is forcing us to also come up with a supporting plan?" After a short pause, Zhang Chen continued. "What is the stance of the Nippon government now?" "Keeping one eye open, but no action yet." "Oh, it seems that they are certain that we will help, so they decided not to join the fun." Zhang Chen's smile gradually disappeared. "Since they asked for it, we'll give them a prescription. Get our agents to prepare. It is time for war." Aisha looked shocked. "Roger, get all the Mickey Mouses out of the country." As for the code name of the mission, Zhang Chen paused for a moment as a wicked smile appeared on his face. "Let's call it 007, 1135 War in the Shadows." On August 20th, Naya, a SIB agent on her way home from a cafe, got into a car accident. Alcohol was detected in the blood of the victim and the accident was initially characterized as drunk driving. But the local police were confused about why her blood contained alcohol if she were at a coffee shop. Coincidentally, almost on the same day, A car was removed from the ditch on the outskirts of Yodo. Two citizens sitting in the front row of the car had both drowned and fake passports were found in their possession. On August 23, also in Yodo, a private room in a club in Ginza caught fire, except for 2 club staff and 3 businessmen that unfortunately died in the fire. No other casualties were reported. August 24. Naki Shipyard. Darkness was about to shroud the city. In an express hotel near the embassy district, the ambassador anxiously paced around in the room. 2 bodyguards stood at the window and the entrance. Their muscular figures made them appear like sculptures. Just then, someone knocked on the door. The 3 people's expressions all tensed up. The 2 bodyguards put their hand into their vest, and the ambassador stopped moving and nervously looked at the door. Knock. Knock. It was 2 long knocks and 1 short knock. The ambassador sighed with relief and waved at the 2 bodyguards. Our own. The door opened and a man dashed into the room. His hair was messy, dark circles were under his eyes, and his eyes appeared bloodshot. From his weary expression, he hasn't lived a peaceful day in a while. Burks and Noosa are dead. While carefully closing the door, Hiss whispered. Nao, who was responsible for providing us intelligence, disappeared on the way to work this morning. Mr. Hirata admitted to accepting bribes. Fuke, our line is completely broken. Stay calm, my friend. The ambassador patted him on the shoulder. Maybe you need to sit for a while and have a cup of hot cocoa. Fuke, I can swear that it must be the ghost agents. When the word ghost agent came out of his mouth, his throat felt like it was stuffed by a cotton ball. His bloodshot eyes widened, and not a single word could come out. What's wrong? The ambassador looked at him hesitantly. Nothing. The man shook his head and pushed away the ambassador's hand. He held his forehead and sat down on the chair. His people were dying of unnatural causes, and he had been pushed to the brink of collapse. The killers, without a trace, were like a dagger against his throat. Just mentioning their name made him fearful. Don't worry, they can't get in. I have installed that thing in the entire hotel, you know. The ambassador sighed and poured him a cup of hot water. He comforted the man and said, I will arrange a plane tomorrow for you to leave. Since your identity has been exposed, it's not suitable for you to stay here. While the optical invisibility of ghost agents was terrifying, times had changed. The Department of Defense's Advanced Project Research Institute had developed at least 10 methods for detecting optical invisibility. From sound wave induction to laser wave path difference sensing, the entire hotel was designed with traps. The ambassador was convinced this place was safe. The man took the cup and hesitated for a moment as he stared at the rising fog. Suddenly, he seemed to have made up his mind, and he gnawed his teeth. No. I will leave tonight. You are in a bad state right now. I suggest you sleep here for 1 night and then I will arrange transportation to take you to the airport tomorrow. No one noticed that a drone was hidden in the darkness, quietly suspended outside the window. The almost invisible laser pointed onto the window and recorded their conversation. Laser monitoring wasn't advanced technology, including the infrared sensor camera on the drone. It could almost be considered as something fairly common. The only difference about this particular drone was that the drone's technological content is a bit more advanced than the drones available on the market. The laser monitoring device retracted and was replaced by a black muzzle. Without realizing that doom had arrived, the man was finally convinced by the ambassador to rest and leave tomorrow. The man put down the cup of water, rested for a moment, and prepared to sleep peacefully for a night before returning home tomorrow. As long as he could step back onto his home soil. Just then, there were gunshots. The drone outside the window opened fire without any warning. 20 bullets unleashed instantly, tearing open the glass and curtains, hitting the man like raindrops. The bullets penetrated the man along with the chair behind him. The man head twitched for a moment in the rain of bullets before his hands and head dropped down. There was not a sign of life in his pupils. The sound of shattered glass almost simultaneously matched with the screams of the ambassador. The hot water and hot blood mixed, soaking the carpet. The other 3 people in the room dropped to the ground immediately when they heard the gunshots. 2 bodyguards hid behind cover, The ambassador rolled to the bottom of the bed. Tensely lying flat, the ambassador didn't even dare to breathe loudly. He desperately tried to shrink his obese body to something as small as possible. Fear was the only emotion he could feel as he watched the man die in front of him. He was a diplomat, not a soldier. Perhaps those colleagues who work in the Middle East would be a little braver, but not him. He had been working in Nippon for more than a decade, and it was the first time a person has died in front of him. He screamed at the top of his lung, "Fouquet, go and inform the guards. Also, get the Marines to come." This group of madmen must have forgotten the Geneva Conventions. How dare they? How dare? A bodyguard gritted his teeth and rushed to the edge of the bed. He took out his pistol and prepared to shoot behind cover. Another bodyguard kicked down the cabinet and used the cabinet as cover to move to the ambassador's side. "Sir, we must escort you out first." "I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going anywhere before I see the Marines." "Take your hand." The ambassador screamed hysterically as he pushed away the hand reaching for him. No one could guarantee that the attacker was not still aiming at this place. No one knew whether that lunatic madman would spare the diplomats. What they didn't know was that it was a drone that attacked them, a drone with only one cartridge. After all 25 rounds of bullets were fired, the drone retreated. 5 kilometers away, also in an express hotel, a girl picked up the drone that came back through the window, closed her laptop and swayed her beautiful short hair. A subtle smile formed as she calmly stuffed the drone and laptop into her bag. She pushed open the door, carried her bag and quickly disappeared into the dark alley. It was as if she was never there in the first place. Chapter 1136. Ms. Kwai is very scared. Miss Boss is very scared. On the evening of August 25th, a SIB intelligence chief was shot dead in front of the ambassador in an express hotel near the embassy. The war of the spies instantly escalated to an unprecedented level. To ensure the safety of the embassy, the IA deployed 2 squads of Marine Corps to the embassy. The ZIN National Intelligence Agency's unexpected move suddenly disrupted SIB's closing plan. SIB was forced to devote all its energy to defending against ZIN agents. Needless to say, as one of the top 3 intelligence agencies in the world, the SIB certainly didn't lack experience in espionage activities. They were only caught off guard, and when they reacted, they immediately revealed their sharp fangs. On August 27, 2 stateless Asians were suspected of being killed by Yakuza members in the suburbs of Yodo. The men were shot and died in miserable deaths with more than 20 gunshot wounds. They were agents of the ZIN National Intelligence Agency. On the same night, an Asian man holding a Nippon passport was shot in a small alley in Yodo. A homeless man spotted the incident. The forensic report detected alcohol and toxins in the blood and the incident was categorized as deliberate murder. From the initial car accident, the murder under the cover of accidents, to the more and more explicit shooting and poisoning, the 2 sides had completely torn off any decency. The state of safety in Yodo deteriorated overnight. The spy war challenged the bottom line of the Nippon government's tolerance countless times and repeatedly refreshed the bottom line. The Nippon government simply couldn't intervene due to the nature of the 2 parties. The Nippon police force had to clean up after both sides while keeping an eye closed on the events unfolding. Withstanding the internal and external pressure, the Nippon Prime Minister even began to question if he chose the right profession. Compared with being an official, he felt like he must possess the resilience of a ninja. The seemingly fierce and violent incidents were surprisingly rational. Both the IA and ZIN have tacitly controlled the battlefield in Nippon and not extended the war to other regions. They also did not involve other unrelated people. In the Yodo Metropolitan Police Department, case files began to pile up on people's desks. It's another murder case? There are more and more murders, and they are all aimed at foreigners. The old sheriff pushed up his glasses and looked at the case file in his hand. Frowning, he said, "I'm afraid it is not as simple as it appears." Recalling the order issued by his superior, the old sheriff thought for a moment before he wrote a few words and then placed the file on the corner of his desk. 3 days later, The case file would be sent to the higher-up agency of the Kyoto Metropolitan Police Department, the National Security Agency of Nippon, and the Special Commissioner of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs would jointly archive the document as confidential. Kwai Hei, who was organizing documents, immediately put down her work and looked at the old sheriff. "Be careful when you go back. It hasn't been really safe lately," the old sheriff reminded. Kwai nodded with a smile and politely said that she would be careful, but she didn't put much thought into it. Even if they're daring, they wouldn't go after the police. Go after the police. The smile on Kwai's face suddenly froze, and her right eye twitched. She did meet someone like that. After work, Kwai hesitated and did not return her pistol. As the sheriff said, safety has deteriorated lately. The police department even issued special documents requiring that all police officers above inspector position are allowed to wield a weapon outside of work hours. After she left the police station, she headed to the Shinkansen. Since the last time she left the mansion under Mount Fuji, Kwai was inexplicably transferred back to Kyoto Metropolitan Police Department. However, instead of feeling any joy for the promotion, she felt a faint sense of fear. She felt an invisible hand, untouched by the judicial system, controlling her fate in its palm. Even though almost half a year has passed, this fear still lingered. Her colleagues always spread rumors around her. For example, an important individual is taking care of her. Well, it is true in nature. She was able to transfer back to Kyoto because Zhang Chen made the request to Sumitomo. She didn't mind the rumors. She had been deliberately trying to fade that memory and to escape the shadow of that man as soon as possible. In fact, she almost did it. At least she thought she did. Kwai took a deep breath and walked on the path she always took. It was already 9 o'clock in the evening, and the shops were all closed. With a high number of murders, there were almost no pedestrians on the street. The evening wind blew into the alley, gently swaying by her bang along with some of the summer heat. At this moment, from the evening breeze, she suddenly smelled a hint of blood. She stopped right away and immediately looked down the alley. She was certain it was the scent of blood. Recalling the recent safety concerns, Kwai was almost certain something must have happened in the alley. Almost without any hesitation, she rushed into the alley. As a devoted police, her safety was never her top concern. Otherwise, she would never have risked her life to get into the club as an undercover cop. However, she stopped after taking 2 steps. A girl in black was standing in the middle of the alley. Her short hair hit her shoulders and drifted in the wind. It looked very unreal and artistic. However, the dead bodies in the alley colored the beautiful scene with blood. "Are you the boss, little lover?" The emotionless voice floated from the distance. As the girl noticed the person behind her, she turned around like a ghost. Then she smiled and nodded with satisfaction. "Nice, you do look pretty." Kwai trembled and reached to her waist, but the coldness of the metal did not give her too much security. Who is your boss's lover?" "I advise you not to do that." The girl noticed Kwai's movement and sighed. "Murderer." Kwai was staring at the girl in front of her eyes and forced out the word from her trembling lips. "Stop, I am a police officer. My colleagues are on their way. I advise you to put your hands up." "Murderer? Police? Surrender?" The girl seemed to have heard something funny and shook her head. "This is not something the police can manage. Don't you see that your prime minister is being silent on this matter? This is war, my child. This is war." In front of Kwai, the girl's smile gradually faded, and finally, she disappeared into the darkness. Kwai's expression turned pale. She pulled out her pistol and pointed it in front of her, shaking with fear. Where did she go? How did she disappear? Could that have been a ghost? Chapter 1137. What will it take for you to stop? How exactly do you want to stop? Sil, 16 years old, born in a slum in Madagascar, Han and Portuguese mix. She's proficient in 5 languages, good at camouflage and drone modification. At the age of 12, she was rescued from a smuggling ship by a celestial trade patrol boat. After that, she was sent to Ghost Island for military training among the 3rd groups of agents. It was good to start early, and training was not an exception. Other than the 1st and 2nd groups of agents, All other ghost agents were orphans from underdeveloped areas and war zones. The older ones were 15 years old while the younger ones were under 10 years old. On Ghost Island, they receive basic education up till high school under closed militarized management, while learning language and the necessary professional knowledge of agents. Before the age of 40, they would serve as a member of Ghost Agents. After the age of 40, they could choose to retire or serve in non-field positions of Ghost Agents. Without celestial trade, most of their fates would be struggling below the poverty line or die as a casualty of the war. The people who gave them their second life were their saviors, and Ghost Island continued to instill this belief into them. When they leave Ghost Island, their thoughts have been entrenched with loyalty. That's why Zhang Chen never worried about their loyalty. At this moment, in the office of the mansion on Koro Island, Zhang Chen looked at the resume and listened to Aisha's report. The Xin intelligence personnel and the USIB's spy war in Nippon had escalated to direct and open engagement. Although Xin also suffered casualties, in general, Xin gained the upper hand. While their intelligence personnel was inferior to the SIB, the powerful assassination ability of ghost agents regained them some ground. This resume is pretty good. However, is being a Han-Portuguese mix. Fine. Camouflage is one of her best abilities, and she can easily switch between Asian and European appearances with makeup. That is really an incredible ability. If it were not an incredible ability, it would not have been included in the resume. Aisha grinned as she saw Zhang Chen's shocked expression. In that case, she can serve as the intelligence commander of Ghost Agents in Nippon. Zhang Chen signed his name on the document. Although, I would have preferred giving Zhu Yu this position. She handled the Tivrius crisis in Yodo quite exceptionally. There is nothing wrong with her abilities. However, her management skill is still a little lacking. It is more suitable for her to engage in anti-espionage work in the country, Aisha said gently. You are her instructor. You know her best, Zhang Chen said. Right. There is another task for you. Aisha's sapphire eyes blinked and she nodded. Have you heard of the name Qian Zia? Aisha tilted her head and remembered the name. The maid that took care of us in Nippon? Yes. Zhang Chen nodded. If it's convenient, get Silt to keep an eye on her. Although the two sides have remained rational and haven't involved other people, it would be impossible to ensure that this demeanor would continue. Just in case, it would be best to prepare beforehand. Also, he did like the little maid who was so obedient. Aisha nodded to signal her understanding, then asked, what about that police? Zhang Chen's expression was a little odd. Aisha looked at Zhang Chen, confused, waiting for him to make a decision. Don't just leave her be, she should be okay. Yes, Aisha nodded, picked up the document that Zhang Chen just signed, and then left. After the door of the office closed, Zhang Chen leaned back into his chair. After looking up at the ceiling for a moment, he closed his eyes. In just 2 weeks, they lost 29 intelligence personnel in foreign countries. In contrast, a total of 37 SIB agents at all levels were executed, and more than half of them were the work of Ghost Agents. If he wanted to completely integrate Nippon into Xin's sphere of influence, then there was no way to circumvent the SIB. The I did not want Nippon to renegotiate the treaty, and it was bound to make moves through the SIB. Zhang Chen's only choice now was to tear a few holes out of the intelligence network the I has been operating since the Cold War era, and then fill in the spaces with the intelligence personnel of Xin with the goal of finally kicking the SIB out. Only Aisha and several senior officials of the intelligence department were aware about this difficult task. Although the report placed on his desk that stated 29 for 37 clearly favored Xin, it was because SIB remained in the open while Xin agents as the newcomers hid in the dark. If the spy war continued, then it would be hard to maintain this ratio until the end. But then again, with the causalities, it was time to decide a victor. If everything goes as planned, I should contact him soon to discuss a peace treaty that will satisfy both parties. Zhang Chen was looking forward to testing Hill's bottom line. His bottom line was 100 people. If the war's damage exceeds 100, maybe he will stop first and look for other options. Of course, maybe he may get hot-headed again and send another 100 agents in. Anyway, The intelligence department of Zin obeys his order. War or peace is at the whim of his thoughts. There is no need for any inefficient cabinet discussion or ridiculous voting. Just as Zhang Chen closed his eyes to meditate, his phone vibrated. They can't take it anymore. Lifting one eyelid, Zhang Chen lazily reached out and opened the holographic screen. However, when he looked at the IP displayed on the screen, he found himself wrong. It was not from Abbott Nippon. He put down his legs that were resting on the table. Zhang Chen fixed his collar, cleared his throat, and then picked up the call. Hello? The Prime Minister holding the phone had a mix of feelings. Honestly, he didn't want to make this call. With Sin and two countries in the midst of a heated battle, it wouldn't serve him any purpose to intervene. What's more, in his position, it would only benefit Nippon for the war to last as long as possible. Only when the two tigers were both tired could Nippon have the opportunity to consolidate their intelligence network, escape the control of the and avoid being controlled by celestial trade. Slowly, Nippon would become a normal country. As for the recent murders, it won't be a big deal since only spies have died. However, now, he was forced to make this call. Celestial Trade had done something recently where he must intervene. Looking at the man in front of him, the Prime Minister tried to make his smile look less rigid. Ahem, Mr. Zhang Chen, I will be straightforward with you. What will it take for you to stop? Chapter 1138. It has time to pick your side. What I have done recently. Sorry, I don't understand. The Nippon Prime Minister's mouth twitched as he looked at Zhang Chen, who was obviously playing dumb, but he remained smiling. Mr. Zhang, I heard that your country has installed a backdoor program in the 20,000 highway magnetic levitation devices exported to our country. Is this true? This is an accusation without any basis. Zhang Chen slapped the table and said with indignation, we have always been honest in doing business. How can we do something like this? Mr. Prime Minister, I want to know who is accusing us. I will reserve the right to sue. Will I tell you that the SIB told me? The Nippon Prime Minister looked at Zhang Chen with suspicion. Obviously, he did not immediately believe his words. Are you sure? Yes. Zhang Chen said, full of certainty. This kind of accusation must be supported by evidence. If you can produce evidence, I will have nothing more to say. But if it's just a few false hearsays, I hope that your country will treat the trade relations between our two countries with caution. It is unwise to be used by someone else. The Nippon Prime Minister looked at Zhang Chen silently. Indeed, he had no evidence. The intelligence was provided by the SIB. Until now, the Nippon intelligence system remained dependent on them. When Zhang Chen mentioned this, he also began to question if he was being used. The same device was sold to who? With this thought in his mind, the Prime Minister smiled. I am sorry to have suspected you. I do apologize. Apologizing immediately indeed fitted the culture of Nippon. But Zhang Chen knew that he didn't just believe his words. The Prime Minister probably already contacted its agency and began sampling Sumitomo Group's construction site. After Zhang Chen ended the call, he leaned back into his chair and sneered. As long as Zin existed, Nippon won't be a normal country. Nippon should just behave like country F and Maro. As a dependent country of Zin, Zin also happened to lack an electronic industrial base. If Nippon could be obedient, he wouldn't mind boosting their economy. As for those magnetic levitation devices, Zhang Chen was not worried about them finding the backdoor program. The backdoor program was designed by Yao Yao. If Zhang Chen personally didn't leak the information, no one would be able to find out. Aside from the magnetic levitation devices, logistics drones, wireless charging stations, future phones, all electronic products were installed with some method for access. IBM did it before, Microsoft, Google, and Apple have also done it. It wouldn't make sense if Future Group didn't do it. All of these electronic products manufactured by Future Heavy Industrials not only exist as products but also as chess pieces that Future Group placed all over the world. The chess pieces would export valuable information using quantum satellites to Koro City's future building. Take Nippon for example. In the future, Yoto would make three-dimensional traffic into a reality with the help of future heavy industries. All magnetic levitation vehicles would be incorporated into the city's eye, while coordinated with the help of eye, they would also be monitored by eye. The collected data through logistics drones, satellites, and other devices would be aggregated into quantum computers. With the powerful information processing capabilities of quantum computers, the Xin National Security Agency could even create a database of behaviors for every citizen. Of course, only authorized agents would have access to the data in the database. To sum everything up in a sentence, once Future Group's products reach over 50% of the country's citizens, then the privacy of the country would be non-existent. The most frightening thing was that people being shrouded by this intelligence network have no idea that they have lost their privacy. If this matter was made public, it would undoubtedly be the biggest scandal in Future Group's history, with significance no less than the PRISM project. 1. However, the premise was that there must evidence to prove Future Group is undertaking such an initiative. This is infuriating. Henry Wilmot, the SIB director, slammed his fist against the table and nodded. Just now, he received news that the body of another SIB agent was found in the suburbs of Yoto. Since the start of this spy war, this was the 40th SIB agent to die in the hands of ghost agents. Speaking of the SIB director position, this position seems to be cursed. The previous two directors stepped down because of Zhang Chen. The last director was involved in plot that involved Zhang Chen on US Oil, and the one before the last was involved with the incident in Hua. They are provoking us to start a war. Is that lunatic not afraid of starting another world war? Wilmot stared at the documents on the table, feeling inexplicable emotions. Just then, Carrie next to him sighed. You said he is a lunatic. Why bother using a normal person's brain to think from his perspective? Carrie indeed understood Zhang Chen's motive after he gained an advantage on the western Pacific Ocean and immediately began to uproot the SIB intelligence network in Nippon. Since the man did place the nuclear button on the negotiating table, against a thug from the Third World, he couldn't think of a way to deal with him. Unless he is the president. With this thought, Carrie's fist tightened and he took a deep breath. Then, he looked over to Wilmot and seemingly talking to himself, he said, I went to visit Naomi Madden yesterday. A sharp sight focused on him. Carrie's mouth moved subtly, and his hands were tucked behind him, responding to Wilmot's vigilant sight. Naomi Madden was his former boss, the unlucky former SIB director who was forced to resign afterward because of his subordinates' plot for the Los Santos incident. If it weren't because of Naomi's fall, Wilmot wouldn't have been able to sit in this position. Slightly hiding the vigilance in his eyes, Wilmot tried to act calm and asked, Oh, how is he doing? Carrie smiled and began pacing around the office with his hands behind his back. Then, he stopped by the bookshelf, paying his bills by offering speeches and living a decent life. It's just a bit quiet in his home. What do you want to say? Wilmot's eyes moved slightly and he said without a change of expression, Mr. Wilmot, if Carrie reached out, as if he was searching for a book, and moved his fingers across the edge of the bookshelf. If the SIB loses the war, do you think you can still sit in this position? The tip of Wilmot's mouth curved up and he said in a slightly mocking tone, Oh, when did the Secretary of State also begin to intervene in the SIB's appointments? Or, is this the message of the President? Don't get me wrong, Gary waved his hand and smiled. I just made a hypothesis. Of course, the Secretary of State does not have this power. The President did not give me any orders. However, allow me to be honest. If your performance is poor this time, it's hard to say the respected President won't use you as a scapegoat. Wilmot's eyes flashed with thoughts and he did not respond. Carrie took a book from the shelf, patted the dust on the cover, and walked to the desk. The FBA people are investigating the Congressional Budget Committee. This is not within the rule. Wilmot's first reaction was to frown, and then his eyes immediately widened and he looked at Carrie in disbelief. It was impossible to be in this position without political sense. When Carrie mentioned the FBA and Congress, he immediately understood the meaning of the Secretary of State. Why is the FBA investigating Congress, and in particular, The Congressional Budget Committee with the closest tie to Wall Street? Carey placed the book he removed from the shelf on the table, and gently tapped on the cover of the book. When Wilmot looked at the cover of the book, Carey stood up, fixed his collar, and smiled at the SIB director. Think about it. It's time to pick your side. You want me to stop the FBI's investigation of Congress? There was a visible shock in Wilmot's eyes as he saw the cover of the book. When Carey looked at Wilmot, who was fighting an internal dilemma, his smile was cheerful. On the contrary, I need you to help me collect evidence that will prove Hill is using the FBI to investigate the Congress. On the thick leather cover of the book in front of Wilmot, a line of gold-colored Latin, written in calligraphy, read, Biography of Harry S. Truman. 1. PRISM. PRISM is a code name for a program under which the United States National Security Agency, NSA, collects Internet communications from various U.S. Internet companies. Source, Wikipedia, Chapter 1139. A peculiar piece. The I couldn't sit still anymore. When the death toll of SIB agents reached 51, the ambassador headed to Zin for a meeting with Zhang Chen. At this time, the number of casualties on the Zin side just surpassed 40, still far from the 100 casualty limit Zhang Chen set. In the office on the top floor of Future Building, Zhang Chen met as Ambassador Holman. Due to the fact that only Holman was visiting and it was not a formal visit, the meeting did not take place in a conference room. There was no small talk or formality. The middle-aged man with a hooked nose just sat down and stared into Zhang Chen's eyes. What do you want? Just cleaning up our garden. Zhang Chen shrugged and smiled. Zhang Chen's understatement made Holman take a slight pause. His aggressive expression suddenly froze on his face. His anger gradually began to spread from his mind to the rest of his body. Cleaning up your garden? Cleaning up your garden? When did Aspost in Asia become your garden? 50 lives are just nothing in your eyes? However, the sly smile on Zhang Chen's face made Holman's anger dissipate. As a diplomat, he would never show his expression, and instincts told him that the man in front of his eyes seemed to be angering him deliberately. Although he didn't understand Zhang Chen's rationale, Holman didn't want to let his plan succeed. It will be meaningless for us to continue this stupid war. I come with peace in mind and to negotiate with you. I hope that Mr. Zhang can cooperate. Holman looked straight into Zhang Chen's eyes and said, I'm going to be straightforward. What are your conditions? Our conditions? Zhang Chen smiled and said unceremoniously, tell your people to pack up and leave, then this war will naturally end. Even if Holman had the best manners, he was furious. His face gradually turned gloomy, and the man with a hooked nose snorted and said in a menacing tone, do you think just because we made concessions to avoid a war in the Western Pacific Ocean, we will always be humble? Are you taking yourself too seriously? Holman's rhetoric was clever as he described changing the course as a concession to avoid war. Although it didn't change the fact they backed down, it did add some momentum to the negotiating process. It was a pity that Zhang Chen did not take the subtle threat in his words seriously. It's not that we take ourselves too seriously. Zhang Chen smiled and looked at Holman, and responded with directness. But you are overestimating yourself. My conditions are already on the table. If you want to stop the war, you can withdraw. After a pause, Zhang Chen looked at him with a sly, of course, if you feel that my proposal is unreasonable, let's continue to fight and determine a victor. The negotiation broke down, or rather, Zhang Chen never expected to resolve this issue through negotiations. Nippon was the front post of the Anastasia. As one of the strategic cores of Asia, the A would never give up on the grasp of this location. However, Zhang Chen was not in a hurry to negotiate with them. Now, Future Heavy Industries was working with Sumitomo Group to build the magnetic levitation highway. When the entire Yoto Road network became Celestial Trades Network, SIB agents better start praying. When Zhang Chen watched Holman get up and leave, he touched his chin and said thoughtfully, it's very strange. If the UA really wants to negotiate with us, they shouldn't have just sent an ambassador. As the office door closed, Aisha's figure surfaced next to him. She was there from the beginning. Before Holman came here, She was discussing sending additional ghost agents to Nippon. They should send the Secretary of State? A. Shaw asked. Yes. Zhang Chen, with his hands still on his chin, was thoughtful. This is very unusual. Carrie didn't come, but someone he never heard of did. In terms of negotiating, did Holman even have the right to negotiate on behalf of the 3 days after the negotiations with Holman broke down, the situation in Nippo changed dramatically in a peculiar way. SIB agents who were originally active in Tokyo seemed to have received some kind of signal, and suddenly stopped their aggressive counterattack and completely went into hiding. Not only did they suspend contact with members of the right-wing party and some pro-leftists, but they even stopped tracking ZIN agents. On the other hand, the clues controlled by Ghost's agents also became dead ends. As if overnight, the SIB agents hid into darkness. This peculiar peace lasted for 3 days. The Nippon National Police Agency was finally relieved. Although it didn't know how long this peaceful period would last, it was a good start. Every time the bodies of foreign friends were dragged out of dark alleys, it must spend countless efforts to take care of the aftermath. Although it was 10 o'clock at night, the lights in the office of the mansion on the east side of Koro Island were still on. Zhang Chen glanced through the report A. Shaw gave him, thought for a moment, and then abruptly asked, "Did something happen in the capital?" Sitting quietly on Zhang Chen's thigh, A. Shaw lowered her head and looked ashamed. "We have not received any new intelligence for the time being. Sorry." ZIN National Intelligence Agency's penetration into the capital had been extremely limited. Although ghost agents could freely enter and exit the country, it had been difficult to infiltrate into the country's political network. Zhang Chen must admit the established powerful anti-espionage capabilities. "Don't be too self-blaming. This is not your fault." Zhang Chen gently lifted the porcelain-like face and comforted. A few days later, when Future Heavy Industries shipyard is complete, I will stay for a bit in Celestial City and then make a trip to Lunar Colony. Do you want to come with me? The sapphire-like eyes suddenly brightened, but they quickly dimmed. Full of regrets, A. Shaw whispered, "I can't leave." Although SIB's actions in Nippon seem to have subsided, no one can guarantee that this peculiar peace will last. As the chief instructor of ghost agents, she must take command in Koro City. That's also true. Zhang Chen looked at A. Shaw apologetically. Then gently stroking her hair, he said, "I will bring you souvenirs. Is there anything you need?" A. Shaw just stared at him with her pristine, watery eyes. The sensual atmosphere gradually dissipated the silence lingering between the duo. After he read the true feeling hidden in her eyes, she immediately understood that she didn't want a souvenir at all, but a consolation. So, he smiled and turned off the lights with the touch of a button on his holographic watch. The last light source in the mansion disappeared as the night shrouded. The bright moonlight scattered its ray on the pristine body. Sweat drenched the desk, wetted the chair, and damped the wooden floor. In this office filled with scholar atmosphere, an unfitting story began to unfold among the books. Chapter 1140 Shipyard Completion. September 7th, a day worth commemorating for Future Group and the entire Earth Defense Alliance. After more than a month of hard work, Future Heavy Industries shipyard was finally completed. Like a satellite city for Celestial City, it floated quietly in the synchronous orbit. From the distance, the entire shipyard looked like two capital U.S. The shipyard would accommodate 10,000 workers, 20,000 construction robots, and thousands of small shuttles. With the support of giant robotic arms on both sides of the shipyard, they would produce ships with a size of more than 500,000 tons. The completion of the shipyard marked the starting point for Earth's first million-ton battleship. The groundbreaking ceremony of the first battleship of the Earth fleet would be held simultaneously with the ribbon-cutting ceremony of the shipyard. At this moment, in the middle section of the shipyard, the invited members of the Earth Defense Alliance states formed into a semi-arc. In the middle of the crowd, an old man in a fancy suit stood in front of a giant steel plate. "May God bless us with his glory and give us a victory." The bishop holding the cross, in a sad, sorrowful voice with his poetic tone, more and unknown verses. He made a cross with his finger on the cold steel. This piece of steel that was blessed would be loaded with the ship that is about to begin construction. When the blessing ended, there was applause. The steel plate was then carried away. Another old man in a robe came forward holding a cross with 3 horizontal crossbeams and repeated the previous ceremony. Religious people were invited to participate in the shipyard ribbon cutting and to give their blessings to the battleship of the Earth Fleet, mainly to meet the requirements of certain countries. Frank Berg first proposed the idea in the name of its people and asked the Catholic pastor to bless the battleship. Russia was a bit unhappy when they heard the proposal. Why do Catholics get to bless the Earth Fleet and not the Eastern Orthodox Church? Without the Eastern Orthodox Church, how would history be written? The Earth Fleet defeated the powerful extraterrestrial civilization under the blessing of God from the West. This will become gloating material for the next 100 years. Who respected their opinions and just expressed their concern to avoid extravagance. When Jiang Chen saw the conflicting opinions between the 2 major member states, he quickly mediated, saying that with so many steel plates on the battleship, there was no point fighting over a single one. Since everyone expressed their desire, why don't we do it together? Fortunately, with the secularization of the world, all the religions agreed to send their blessings together. The Earth Defense Alliance Committee then voted to pass a regulation that, as long as the member states apply, all member states were permitted to send blessings with the religion of their choice on the first battleship. As for how history would be written, it would be based on their preference. Precisely because of this, the religious ceremony took place as part of the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Jiang Chen didn't mind the presence of the religious leaders that sent their blessings as long as they didn't leave engravings that stated their visit at his shipyard. Zen advocates for atheism and allows for the freedom of religion. Jiang Chen himself is a complete atheist that is neither a sincere heart nor in awe of a spiritual figure. Jiang Chen half-heartedly applauded and thought in his mind, God can't save the Earth civilization, but I can. You should worship me rather than God. The ribbon-cutting ceremony soon came to an end. As the executive director of the Earth Defense Alliance, Jiang Chen stood in front of everyone, read the remarks from the executive and the goals of the Earth before concluding the entire ceremony. In the middle of thunderous applause, Jiang Chen nodded to the camera with a smile, walked down the temporary stage, and let out a long sigh in his mind. This is finally done. TS Seagull will enter the moon orbit in 5 minutes. Please return to your seats as soon as possible. Jiang Chen opened his eyes, slightly turned his face, and his eyes met with a pair of bright eyes. You're awake? Looking at Jiang Chen, who has just woken up, Xiaxu's aloof state melted into a blooming smile. Xiaxu was already up half an hour ago. Because she had nothing to do, she stared at Jiang Chen out of boredom, and half an hour quickly passed. With sleepy eyes, Jiang Chen yawned, sat up, and stretched. Then he looked out the window. We're already here? The crew said there is still 10 minutes. Xiaxu looked at the moon near the window, as she felt her fantasy came true. This is my first time being so close to the moon. You'll be even closer in a bit, and you will eventually stand on it, Jiang Chen teased. Because they were in first class, only the 2 of them sat in the compartment. However, the entire passenger compartment consisted of 2,000 passengers. The normal cabin was still relatively tight. Yesterday, after attending the party succeeding the ribbon-cutting ceremony, he and Xiaxu rushed onto the flight to the moon. 4 Seagull-class transport ships served celestial trade, one of which operated the route between Mars and Earth and another operated for the Space Defense Forces. Only 2 flights operated each day between Celestial City and Lunar City. If they missed it, they would have to wait another 12 hours. After a total of 10 hours, TS Seagull finally entered Moon's orbit. The entire lunar city resembled a bright silver medal from this position, embedded in the center of a large crater. Although it was not the first time Jiang Chen saw the panoramic view of the city, it was his first time witnessing this spectacular scene with his own eyes. If he sat in the regular cabin, he would definitely hear the marvel of passengers. Of course, he would be marveled by the passengers as well. Ziyash's eyes were filled with amazement as she gazed out the window. As their line of sight gradually moved from the colony to space, she suddenly said, "Why don't we build a space elevator on the moon?" Because the moon has no synchronous orbit. At the colony a bit closer and closer, Zhang Chen smiled. But it's a good idea to build an elevator that leads to the orbit. It's only 200 kilometers, only 1/108th of Earth's synchronous orbit. The moon's gravity was only 1/6 of the Earth's, and the moon elevator would require far less cable strength than the space elevator. Even the high-strength, high-heat resistance composite fiber called Zilong could be used as a material for the moon elevator. The company that designed Zilong had requested countless times for Zhang Chen to contract out the moon elevator project for Lunar City to them. However, Zhang Chen completely disregarded their request. "This is Future Heavy Industries' job, not yours." Ziyash's words reminded him of this as he became deep in thought. After he arrived in Lunar City, he should take a close look at the port cargo throughput and the floating population. If necessary, he would ask Kelvin to establish a project to build the moon elevator. The gravity of the moon itself was minimal compared to Earth, and because the lack of atmosphere, even without a synchronous orbit, the spacecraft won't have much trouble landing on the moon's surface. An aircraft with a capacity of fewer than 100,000 tons could directly land on the surface. A transport ship with a carrying capacity of more than 100,000 tons could directly drop its cargo. That's right, just drop its cargo. After the rectangular cargo cabin separate from TS Seagull, 2 small propulsion jets would reduce the speed as the cargo lands. 4 cabins dropped onto the surface. There was only 1 passenger cabin while the other 3 were cargo cabins. The passenger cabin landed steadily on the airport strip. An enclosed escalator with a length of around 10 meters and a width of 2 meters extended to a rectangular transfer station next to the airport. As the signal light illuminated, the passengers loaded onto the escalator and moved towards the transfer station. From there, an underground tunnel directly connected the passengers to a light rail track that was destined for Lunar City 2 kilometers away. It was many people's first time visiting the moon. When they were on the escalator, they peeked excitedly at their surroundings. They took out their phones, took photos and videos, and shouted at the craters. The tour guides of the tour groups held their flags calmly, reminding everyone to tie on the magnetic belts and follow the group. The floor of Lunar City was made of alloy steel. When disembarking from the transport ship, everyone received a magnetic belt. For people yet to master the essence of moonwalking, the most sensible choice would be to remain on the ground. When all the passengers disembarked, Zhang Chen took Ziyash's hands and took her to the transfer station. As the owner of the city, he certainly wouldn't squeeze onto the light rail. As soon as he sat on the Seagull, a lunar rover had stopped at the transfer station, waiting for his arrival. On this lunar rover the size of an armored vehicle, Zhang Chen saw the former lunar colony chief, now the mayor of Lunar City, Tang Weiji, and several other senior executives of the city. "Welcome to the moon, President Zhang and CEO Ziya." Tang Weiji respectfully bowed and politely greeted. Chapter 1141 Moon Specialties. The lunar rover moved smoothly on the crater-filled moon surface. After it passed through a tunnel on a slope, it entered the interior of a mountain and Zhang Chen's vision suddenly cleared up. A silver-white city silhouette appeared in front of him. The lunar colony is in the front. Of course, it has now been renamed to Downtown of Lunar City. All the municipal buildings will be built around the downtown square. The surface is only a small part of the city. Once you're underground, it will be even more shocking. Beside the window of the lunar rover, Tang Weiji pointed to the silver-white outline outside the window as he chatted with Zhang Chen. "We have prepared a welcoming ceremony for you and CEO Ziya. I hope it won't be too much trouble." Zhang Chen smiled and looked at the entrance of Lunar City outside the window. "Haha, believe me, it is definitely not." Zhang Chen had never been a fan of being fixated on small details. Compared with flattering and sucking up on the surface, He preferred to see tangible results. The experience of living in Hua in the early years made him well aware of the low efficiency of a bureaucratic system. The advanced technology products didn't please him the most, but rather, the vitality and energy of a startup even inside this massive company. Future Group's innovation was not corroded by the management's thinking. The culture at the top determined the performance on the bottom. Tang Hanji, the mayor of Lunar City, knew the style of his boss, so when he was preparing the welcoming ceremony, he made it grand but not too long. After the welcoming ceremony on the Colonial Square, Tang Hanji personally acted as the guide for the duo. He took the duo to the elevator next to the square. Once they were on the elevator, they descended about 500 meters. When the elevator stopped and the doors opened, a fresh and dry gust of air blew onto their faces. Outside the elevator was a circular hall with more than 30 identical elevators inside. Here, the elevators served a similar purpose as a subway station on Earth, connecting the underground living space with the mining stations and factories on the surface. The circular hall was bustling with people, from those in celestial trade uniforms to passengers in all kinds of outfits. Tang Weiji took Zhang Chen and Zai Ashe to the special tunnel on the side, and directly entered the underground city. This place used to be an underground glacier. Later, after the ice layer was mined, we found a lava tunnel formed by the ancient magma activity below the ice. The surrounding rock is a glassy black volcanic rock, which is even stronger than concrete. So we decided to seal the space with aluminum and transform it into the colony's living space. The temperature difference on the surface of the moon is high, but the underground temperature is stabilized at around 25 degrees Celsius, and it can also effectively reduce the impact of harmful rays and meteorites. A total of more than 27,000 people now live here, and the elevator has become the main form of transformation in the city. Tang Weiji described the city's changes to Zhang Chen as they moved forward. Although the city was built under his inspiration, when he finally stood in the city, he still felt moved by its magnificence. No one had thought that the small colony with only 200 colonists would expand to this size in the span of a year. Only half of the city is developed, and the other half is still being built. Later, we will use the lava tunnel of the extinct volcano to double the area of the volcano cave. By the time, the city will easily fit over 100,000 people. Looking at his boss's touched expression, Tang Weiji was proud. As they continued to tour the city, Zai Ashe looked around and gently pulled on Zhang Chen's sleeve. She whispered, "Is there water here? I'm a little thirsty." The assistant behind Tang Weiji immediately stepped forward and took out 2 new stainless steel cups from her bag. She smiled and handed them to the two. "This is one of the specialties of the Moon brand functional beverage." Tang Weiji took the opportunity to introduce the product to Zhang Chen. "There shouldn't be any moon soils inside, right?" Zai Ashe joked. "Haha." The assistant lady chuckled. "What is this? It doesn't feel like plastic." Zhang Chen examined the bottle. "A new type of PVC material. It is an anti-rust, lightweight steel that weighs only 1.2 times that of plastic with the same volume. Its surface material has a germicidal effect similar to that of activated carbon. The most important thing is that the production of steel on the moon is much cheaper than plastic." "Right. This is the work of the Material Science Lab," Tang Weiji explained. "Really? I didn't expect this small cup to have such a long story." Zhang Chen smiled, unscrewed the lid, and sucked on the straw. It tasted a bit strange. It tasted like herbal tea, but much sweeter than herbal tea. Zhang Chen felt energetic after he took a sip. He felt even better than after drinking coffee or Red Bull. When they arrived at the end of the corridor, Tang Weiji led them through an arched door. They passed through the air shower and entered a factory. Rows of culture racks stood in the factory and were distributed on the factory floor. Dozens of culture tanks were placed on each culture rack, and ultraviolet lamps were mounted on the top. Through the glass wall, Zhang Chen saw the seedlings growing prosperously. "Is this a farm?" Zhang Chen looked at the nearest culture tank. "Yes, but this farm mainly produces cash crops, or the raw materials of this drink, such as potatoes, radishes, and pumpkins." Tang Weiji walked to Zhang Chen and pointed. 90% of the food in Lunar City is imported from Celestial City. It's not technologically difficult to farm on the moon, just other factors make it almost impossible. At first, the farms were all built on the surface of the moon. However, due to the cosmic ray, even with lead plates installed as covers, the crops would still mutate during its germination stage. Later, it was discovered that the soil on the moon effectively absorbed harmful cosmic rays and solar wind particles. Therefore, they simply moved the farm underground, leaving only one small plantation used for breeding selection. Other infrastructures on the surface were mines and factories. What is the daily average traffic volume in Lunar City? Zhang Chen reached out and touched the sprouts of the potato seedlings in the culture tank. The average daily passenger throughput was 3,417 last month. Tang Weiji immediately replied, "What about cargo throughput?" The cargo throughput last month exceeded 900,000 tons. This figure would likely exceed 10 million tons annually considering the continuous expansion of rare earth production in 2019. Zhang Chen did the math in his head, and after a moment of indulging, he smiled at Tang Weiji. "I plan to build a 200-kilometer elevator in Lunar City. I want to hear your opinion." Chapter 1142 The Concept of Moon Elevator. A moon elevator? When Tang Weiji heard Zhang Chen's proposal, he first took a moment to digest this information, then joy was his immediate reaction. A moon elevator? I don't have any opinions. It'll be great for Lunar City. I have discussed this with people from several other departments a few days ago. If it is possible to connect the surface with the orbit with an elevator, the cargo handling efficiency of the city will at least double. Even without the efficiency gain, an elevator would save a countless amount of energy. Future heavy industries already accumulated a wealth of experience in the construction of Celestial City. The construction of the elevator, only 200 kilometers long, could easily be completely even without the wreckage from the apocalypse. After the tour, Zhang Chen strolled around the underground city while he discussed the construction of the moon elevator with Tang Weiji. The elevator's specifications would not need to be as large as the one on Earth. Even living spaces could be omitted. Only 4 rotating counterweights would be needed at the end with space for docking. The moon still had a countless amount of space for development, so development in space wouldn't be necessary. What's more, because there was no synchronous orbit, the elevator couldn't rely on the inertial force to maintain its balance. Hence, a project too large would drive up the cost. For Lunar City, with the goal to save costs, it would not be worth the trouble. After the first day of the visit, the group took the elevator back to the surface. With Tang Weiji leading, Zhang Chen and Zai Ashe went to the hotel. Although living spaces in the city were mostly concentrated underground, this was only the case for the average citizen. After all, a trip to the moon was difficult and rare. If it were possible, no one wants to live in a narrow tunnel and stare at a cold ceiling. It was precisely because of this, as well as the high maintenance cost of the building on the surface, that the land price on the surface of the city was comparable to gold prices. Only the millionaires could afford to live inside a hotel on the surface, and those independent houses with lunar rovers, garages, and saunas were reserved for the wealthiest individuals. As for private properties, there were no plans for building residential areas in Lunar City. All the properties for sale were underground at a depth of 500 meters, and the price was often too high. The most peculiar thing was that there was no supply even with at such outrageous prices. Inside the steaming bath, Zhang Chen was enjoying a bath on the moon while gazing at the distant blue planet, letting his mind drift off. Bathing didn't feel too different on the moon. How much of his body is exposed is only dependent on the difference between body density and water density. It has nothing to do with gravity. Just when Zhang Chen was zoned out, he heard clothes being taken off. The clothes were placed in a basket and gentle steps were heard on the tiles. With the footsteps gradually approaching, a smile formed on Zhang Chen's face, and soon through the mist, a smooth foot tapped on the surface of the water. "It's not hot, just come in," Zhang Chen said. Zai Ashe's face turned into the color of a ripped apple. She quickly sat in, covered her chest. She looked at Zhang Chen sitting across from her, biting her lips, and then whispered, "I thought you were already asleep." "Almost fell asleep," Zhang Chen smirked. "Now I can't sleep at all. How do you plan to compensate me?" Zayasha rolled her eyes as she saw the slatin on his face. After she hesitated for a moment, she finally overcame her shame and obeyed her heart. She slowly moved her thighs and sat closer to Zhang Chen. The moment she pressed her face against his chest, she felt as if her pounding heart was about to escape her body. It took a while before her pumping heart gradually calmed down. A meteorite pierced through space and landed not far away from their window. Holding Zayasha's slender shoulder and gazing at the dust floating outside due to the meteorite's impact, Zhang Chen was emotional. "Only if I could move the Holy Shield." "The Holy Shield?" Zayasha moved her head and did not understand. "Accurately speaking, it's called the Holy Shield system." There were some important cities in the apocalypse such as Wanghai and Shangjing projected by this system. It is like the shield outside a spacecraft in sci-fi movies. Pan-Asia cooperation was invested in defensive technology, but so far, the scientists that I have raised have not been able to fully understand the technology. Zhang Chen sighed with regret. Perhaps she was teased by a particular word, but Zayasha began to giggle. She buried her face against Zhang Chen's shoulder as she began to shake. "Raising scientists. Ha ha ha. Hey, this is not that funny." Zhang Chen had a helpless expression on his face as he watched how difficult it was for Zayasha to contain her laughter. "I'm raising them. When I pay them their salary each month, I always ask if they want money or food. However, they usually don't say anything. Instead, they just pick up the bag of rice and the box of canned meat and then go home happily." With Project Garden of Eden, even survivors in slums occasionally enjoyed delicate flower food, but food remained one of the most heavily sought-after commodities on the wasteland. Even with the occasional depreciation of the credit, the amount of food consumed rarely changed. It was better to sell the extra food at the 6th Street than to directly accept credits as a salary. After he soaked for more than an hour, Zhang Chen's exhaustion disappeared. He took a long time in the change room before coming out while stretching. It was 7 o'clock at night in Xin and there was a banquet waiting for him. Entrepreneurs with a total investment of more than 1 billion new Xin dollars in Lunar City would be present, as well as top figures of the city. The purposes of this banquet were to celebrate the permanent population of Lunar City reaching more than 30,000, then to celebrate the construction of the first battleship of the Earth Fleet, and lastly to welcome Lord Zhang Chen's visit to the city. No doubt, the last reason was the most important one. For those capitalists chasing behind celestial trade, Zhang Chen's existence could be compared to a breathing gold mine. The capitalists would be extremely satisfied to have a chat or a drink with him to make this trip worthwhile. If he casually pointed to a direction on the moon, revealing the next area of expansion of the city, the move alone would create a few millionaires. Naturally, when he walked into the banquet hall with Zayasha, they immediately became the focus of the entire banquet. Chapter 1143 An Unexpected Gs. This is my business card and please allow me to introduce myself. I'm the chairman of the Siberian Mining Company and the Russian Asteroid Mining Company. It's an honor to meet you. An old man in a tuxedo politely handed Zhang Chen his business card with both hands, then warmly shook hands with him. Are you really Zhang Chen? Ah, sorry, because my idol is standing in front of me. I'm a little shaken by the excitement. Are you free tonight? Do you want to have a drink together? A blonde celebrity in a low-cut evening dress looked at Zhang Chen seductively, completely disregarding the warning smile Zhang Chen's date was giving her. Please allow me to have a toast with you, the executive of the Earth Defense Alliance, the commander of the Earth Fleet, the hero of human civilization. Ahua entrepreneur smiled, revealing his shining white teeth. He then raised the champagne glass in his hand, I wish you victorious and that you bring victory and glory back to the place we call home. Melodious music changed the mood in the banquet hall and saved Zhang Chen from the enshrinement of flattery. The male and female guests all put down the glass in their hands and joined hands together to enter the middle of the hall. Tang Weiji and his wife led the banquet to the next stage. This glass is really interesting. Is it magnetic underneath? Because he didn't know how to dance. Zhang Chen took Xiaoshu's hand and walked to the resting area. After he drank the red wine in the glass, he turned the glass over to examine the bottom of the cup and felt that it was metallic. To prevent the wine glass from flying around in a low-gravity environment, a magnet must have been installed under the long table covered with red cloth. Not just wine glasses, but also the trays that hold food. Although life on the moon was full of inconveniences, the creativity of people was unlimited. From the smooth and elegant moves on the dance floor, everyone was enjoying the party. Did you like the banquet? At the end of the banquet, Tang Weiji, holding a glass of wine, brought his wife to greet Zhang Chen. Of course, I enjoyed it. I'm so relieved to see how relaxing the life of Lunar City's citizens is. Zhang Chen clinked his glass with Tang Weiji. Tang Weiji's wife looked young, probably about 20 years old. From her reserved and elegant temperament, she should come from an influential family. It didn't take her long to start a conversation with Xiaoshu. After the men began to talk about business, she and Xiaoshu went to the side and began chatting about topics reserved only for women. I wouldn't say relaxing. Tang Weiji laughed, sipped the wine, and humbly said, I think it's exploring a lifestyle that suits us. I remember when I first came here, we stayed in the gravity room all day after we completed our tasks. Before the underground city was built, there was really no entertainment on this barren land. It must have been hard. Zhang Chen raised his glass. I will remember your contribution. Not at all. It's my duty, not a contribution. Tang Weiji responded modestly. Lunar City's model can be applied to other colonies, such as the Mars colony, and the Himalaya one. In the near future, you have provided a template for the space colonization plan of celestial trade. How is this not a contribution? Modesty can be boring. Zhang Chen patted Tang Weiji's shoulder as he put down the wine glass. Just as the two of them chatted, an older man in a tuxedo entered the banquet hall quite late. He searched around the room before his eyes lit up and he walked toward his target. While Zhang Chen and Tang Weiji chatted about the colony, he saw a familiar face. Before he could speak, the man smiled and extended his right hand. We met again, Mr. Zhang Chen. It was when the man shook hands with Zhang Chen did he finally remember he had seen this face. However, to be truthful, after so long, he almost forgot about him. You are Mr. Loki? It seems that you haven't forgotten me, Loki said jokingly and didn't seem to mind that Zhang Chen didn't recognize him. It was quite amazing for Zhang Chen to remember him considering that he was a behind-the-scenes person who rarely appears in front of the public. People also have difficulty recognizing people of different races. To be honest, he was ready to introduce himself again. But why are you here? Zhang Chen was surprised by his visit, frowning slightly. I mean, shouldn't you be in B City now? How are you? Precisely speaking, I was in Celestial City 11 hours ago. As a result, when I was planning to meet with you, I learned that you have left. Very coincidentally, there was one final flight leaving for Lunar City, so I came here. Loki laughed. Our consortium has invested in a rare earth mining company in Lunar City. Otherwise I would have to worry about how to get an invitation, right? What a coincidence, Zhang Chen said without much fluctuation in his emotion. The B City Consortium then must have a profit. A flight happened to leave Lunar City, and he managed to obtain a ticket in such a quick span of time. Although it is not tourist season, buying a ticket wasn't that easy. The ticket must have been bought a few days in advance. It seems that you two have something to talk about. Now, if I may excuse myself. Seeing that he wasn't needed in their conversation, Tang Weiji understandingly left with his wife. As Loki watched Tang Weiji leave, he smiled. Then he looked at Zhang Chen again and said politely, Is it convenient to step out for a moment? It's not a gentleman's move to leave your date alone at the banquet. Mr. Loki, What do you think? Loki heard the subtle refusal in Zhang Chen's tone as he raised his eyebrow. Ziyasha looked at Zhang Chen and just wanted to tell him that she would not mind, but Zhang Chen stopped her with the look in his eyes. When the Rothschild family existed, he did not like the WASP on Wall Street. The two sides formed an alliance long ago against the Freemasonry led by the Rothschild family. However, the capitalists of Wall Street are cunning and clever. When Celestial Trade and the Freemasonry clashed, they didn't contribute any effort but took the opportunity to benefit. After the fall of the Rothschild family, several WASP consortia such as Morgan and Rockefeller immediately began to snatch up assets from the fallen giant. They took the two most prized possessions, the Brazilian Vale and the BHP Mining Group. These spoils should have belonged to Celestial Trade. Under such circumstances, it would be odd if Zhang Chen treated them with respect. Loki didn't seem to be surprised by Zhang Chen's aloof attitude. He smiled, took a sip of his wine, and sighed. Oh, even if I want to talk about the SIB, 1, Himalaya, or Jupiter Vi, is the largest irregular satellite of Jupiter. It is the fifth largest Jovian satellite, after the 4 Galilean moons. Chapter 1144. There is no permanent alliance. After Loki said this, Zhang Chen finally understood why he chose to meet him at this place. Indeed, it was absolutely safe here. Due to the distance, the communication channel between the Moon and Earth was completely under Celestial Trade's control. He didn't need to worry about the SIB's presence. Although Zhang Chen felt that he was being overly cautious, Loki still insisted that it was necessary. After the banquet, Ziyasha went back to the hotel and Zhang Chen went to the lounge next to the banquet hall with Loki. After they sat down, Loki took out the cigar box from his suit pocket, pulled out a cigar and put it in his mouth. He was just about to take out his lighter when he suddenly stopped and looked to Zhang Chen. Do you mind? Zhang Chen shook his head. Thank you. Grinning, Loki grabbed the cigar cutter and skillfully cut the cigar head. After he lit the cigar on fire, he blew out a ring, fully satisfied. He raised his eyebrow and offered, "Do you want one?" "I'll pass." Zhang Chen shook his head, leaned back on the chair, and then looked at the old man enjoying himself. Let's get to the point. Carrie is preparing to participate in the 2020 election, Loki said nonchalantly as he also leaned back into his chair. Zhang Chen took 3 seconds to digest his sentence and then raised his eyebrow. So, it seems that you aren't informed of the intelligence from the capital. Loki grinned and shrugged. Through the smoke clouds, his eyes were filled with mysteriousness. Do you know who is supporting Carrie? Who else other than Wall Street? Zhang Chen laughed. This question is just as boring as asking why Zhang Yaping can be re-elected year after year. No. Loki swayed the cigar between his fingers. There are a lot of companies on Wall Street. You can't consider Wall Street as a whole. My question is, who do you think is the main supporter behind Carrie? You can't consider Wall Street as a whole. Zhang Chen's eyes flickered as he carefully pondered the meaning behind this sentence. Loki looked at the silent Zhang Chen and didn't seem to be in a hurry. He continued to enjoy his cigar, waiting for Zhang Chen's answer with the same mysterious grin on his face. The silence lasted another 5 minutes before Zhang Chen spoke up. Obviously, you can tell me. Yes, I can tell you. Loki straightened his back, extended his finger and wrote on the table. After Zhang Chen looked over, it was an uppercase M. Zhang Chen frowned as he looked at the movement of his hand. Morgan. Zhang Chen was not surprised by Wall Street's manipulation of the election since it didn't just happen once or twice. The existence of K Street and political contributions exist exactly because of this. As for why Carrie decided to run for the election, Morgan's decision to invest, while he was somewhat surprised, it was nothing astonishing. What surprised him was that Loki told him all these things. Yes, I can tell you, Carrie has already got the SIB on board. Loki leaned back against the chair again, crossed his fingers over his knees, and then continued. The FBA is investigating members of Congress, and the SIB is closely watching the FBA. It's interesting, isn't it? I bet that the 2020 election will be the most exciting one in history. The most interesting thing is that you gave this information to someone who is not friendly with the Zhang Chen's smile seemed to be embedded with a deeper message. He looked at Loki with intrigue. Can you tell me why you are doing this? Haha, you and I are all businessmen. Do you think that nationality is something very important to us? If you really care about such an identity, you wouldn't have created a new one for yourself, as Loki explained. He took out a photo from his suit pocket and threw it on the table. Zhang Chen looked at the photo and was just about to ask when Loki began to explain. Joseph Kennedy. Zhang Chen frowned. Except for the surname Kennedy, I have never heard of someone named Joseph. Why does that matter? Many successful candidates were unknown to the masses before they took part in the election. Shrugging, Loki blew out another smoke ring. The election is like a horse race. You have to find a prospective candidate with potential, and as long as we are willing to bet on them, there is always a chance. For example, the dark horse in 2008. Who knew about him before 2007? Oh, then why do you think I will participate in your gambling? Zhang Chen laughed. To put it blatantly, these are your issues. Because I will give you enough benefits. Loki stared into Zhang Chen's eyes. If Kennedy is elected, we can consider giving you Nippon, or even join the Earth Defense Alliance. I have to say, this proposal is really attractive, but your credit history is not convincing. Zhang Chen looked at Loki with a sly smile. To be honest, I don't trust you. What can you do to make me believe that you will fulfill your promise? There are only a handful of people in the world that can guarantee a 50% chance in any election. If you can't even guarantee it for yourself, how can you guarantee it for me? When Loki heard Zhang Chen's words, he smiled and took the photo back. Let's not worry about Mr. Kennedy for now. Have you considered the consequences of Kerry being elected? Do you think Celestial Trade is still the Celestial Trade 2 years ago? Zhang Chen spread his hands. Even if Roosevelt climbed out of his grave, do you think I would care? More than 2 years ago, in order to open up the desalination market in the Middle East, high-tech freshwater was forced to go public on Nasdaq to reduce the U.S. vigilance. At that time, Celestial Trade was just like an ant in front of any of the free world's aircraft carrier battle groups could give the Panu people democracy. However, now, even if the US sent all of its aircraft carrier battle groups to the western Pacific Ocean, at most, it would be a lose-lose situation for Celestial Trade. Even if Kerry does get elected, what could he do? Well, I believe that you are strong enough to ignore the military power of the entire NATO. Loki shrugged and stretched out the hand holding the cigar. But now there are better choices in front of us. Why don't you consider it? Mr. Kennedy will put more emphasis on the space industry than all previous presidents, advocate for erasing the prejudice between the two countries, abandon the new Cold War mentality, and fight against the extraterrestrial civilization. Everything I'm talking about will be included in his speech. These are not empty promises. After Loki said all this, he pressed his hands against the armrests and slowly stood up. He threw the burnt cigar into the ashtray and looked at his watch. I will stay here for 2 more days. I hope that you can seriously consider our offer. If we join hands, we may be able to avoid an unnecessary war. After that, Loki walked to the door. There is still a question that I don't quite understand. Zhang Chen watched as Loki head to the door, and abruptly said, "Aren't you part of WASP?" Loki let go of the door handle, turned around, and said in a ridiculing tone, "When Mr. Rothschild was still alive, weren't we all allies in the same trench?" Chapter 1145 The Cursed Name. We are facing the worst depression since 2008. However, our president doesn't seem to be aware of this, or rather, she has noticed the problem, but she hasn't been treating this problem with seriousness. Enterprises and families are facing a credit crunch, our pension and wallet are shrinking, wages have fallen to their lowest point since the 2008 economic crisis, yet our cost of living has reached the highest it's been in history. Look at what our president has done for us. In order to let us temporarily forget about the pain of not being able to repay our credit card, she stressed that she would return to the Asia-Pacific region, escalate regional disputes, divert our attention, and even send the aircraft battle group for a stroll in the West Pacific Ocean. The result was that she fooled no one but herself. and almost pushed our country to the brink of a world war. Maybe she thinks our life is not miserable enough. I heard that she is now discussing with her cabinet about restricting the import of medical drones. My only suggestion is to spend more time with the cute little angels. Maybe they will be taken away by the FBA tomorrow, and no drones will ever fly into the window to save you. Thank goodness. We will return to the era of calling to make an appointment with the doctor. Perhaps this will save us a lot of money. After all, in that era, we didn't take medicine when we had a fever. In the holographic screen, the man in the suit stood in the middle of the supporters and had a bright smile on his face. Unlike the aggressive speech, he was not speaking at a fast pace. He could even be described as gentle, but the words he said were as sharp as the best knife. From the art of this speech alone, Mr. Kennedy was indeed worthy of his name. What are you watching? Zayasha slipped into the blanket, held her chin up with her hands, and lied beside Zhang Chen. Joseph Kennedy's declaration for the presidential election. Zhang Chen dragged the holographic screen toward Zayasha. Kennedy? Zayasha was surprised and confused by the name. The fabled Kennedy? Yes, the cursed name. Zhang Chen looked at the man who waved to his supporters on the holographic screen. A sly smile suddenly formed on his face. What do you think if I pushed this cursed man onto the president's throne? Will it be interesting? As if you have a coat. Zayasha rolled her eyes, turned around, and muttered, "You can keep watching, I'm going to sleep first." Hey, wife, it's not good to sleep so early. Zhang Chen sent a message to the ghost agents, turned off the screen, and extended his arm to surround her smooth shoulder. As he looked at the earlobe that gradually turned red, he whispered into her ear, "Didn't we agree that we were going to continue what we didn't finish in the bathroom?" The redness extended all the way to her neck. The word wife poked into her soft spot as Zayasha turned soft. Although she knew that the word didn't just apply to her, at least for now. Even if it was only now, he only held her. If the nightmare of long-distance travel was jet lag, then the nightmare of a trip to the moon was never knowing if the time difference was right. Of course, compared to the stunning view of the trip, this nightmare was only a small inconvenience. A day on the moon was equivalent to 27.3 Earth days, and a day and night were 2 weeks long. Looking at the sun that just rose into the sky, Zhang Chen yawned and wondered if he should create a new calendar for celestial trades colonies. For example, all celestial trade colonies, regardless of the orbital period, must use the Earth calendar and Xin time zone, or adopt a double time format. Today, he must make a trip 100 kilometers north of Lunar City. After a 1.5-month training period on Koro Island, the recruits of the Earth Defense Alliance arrived on the moon by transport ships. Half of the 3 months training period passed, and the remaining 1.5 months would be spent on the moon for low-gravity environment adaptation training. Although without any weapons, these volunteer soldiers were also combatants, and certainly couldn't be stationed in Lunar City. In order to house the future officers of the Earth Fleet, Celestial Trade built a military base to be used as the training facility. The military base on the moon was not completed until a month ago. At present, in addition to the 500 volunteer soldiers in the military base, another 1,000 reserve crew members were also stationed here. The purpose of Zhang Chen's trip was to greet the future officers of the Earth Fleet while he inspected the military base. Simply put, a military parade. The tires lifted them tossed. Zhang Chen gazed at the unchanged crater outside the window and yawned in boredom. At first, he thought the scenery on the moon was very fascinating. Now, he was already bored of it. 2 hours passed since departure. Zayasha sat next to him. She was also bored with the same scenery outside and began to inspect the inside of the car. When her eyes stopped on the thermometer on the armrest of the seat, she gasped in shock. "It is already 90 degrees outside?" Zhang Chen smiled at Zayasha's reaction. "It's not that bad. This is not the hottest time of the day." At noon, the surface temperature on the equator line can reach 127 degrees. That hot? What do you think? Why else do you think the building of Lunar City is painted white? I thought it was for appearances. Zayasha blushed. Then she whispered, "If we get off the vehicle, will be roasted. The term roasted almost made Zhang Chen laugh out loud. He didn't expect this unserious term to come out of Ziyash's mouth. 127 degrees is the surface temperature. Looking at Ziyash's boots, Zhang Chen said, "As long as you don't lose your boots, you don't have to worry." Of course, they still must change into professional gear before they exit the vehicle. The 3-hour drive was finally over, and the lunar rover parked outside the military base. In the locker room inside the rover, Zhang Chen and Ziyash changed into heavy spacesuits. After confirming the spacesuit's functionality, under the guidance of the staff, they entered through the hatch and stepped onto the surface of the moon. The moment when Ziyash's feet stepped on the moon, she seemed to have forgotten her identity as CEO. Unlike a child, she jumped up in excitement. Zhang Chen smiled as he watched Ziyash enjoy the amazing moment. Such childish behavior was certainly a rare scene. However, as she enjoyed flying on the moon, she lost control and flipped in the air. She then landed face first and rolled onto the ground. Zhang Chen looked at Ziyash's tragic fall and chuckled. He was not gloating. He just thought the fall was too cute. Zhang Chen hopped up and extended his legs straight to drift by her. Then he grinned and pulled her up from the ground. "I told you to be careful. Now you just made fun of yourself." Although he couldn't see Ziyash's face through the dark mask, based on his understanding of her, she must be blushing, biting her lower lip, and feeling embarrassed. Chapter 1146 $50 million compensation. The hexagonal fortress, quietly located in the middle of the small crater, was like a metal embedded into the surface. The sturdy moon soil was its first wall, and a tunnel was carved on one side of the crater. It was the only entrance to the entire military base. The entire military base located in the crater covered a total area of 9,000 square meters with 3 floors above and below. Each floor was 5 meters high, with the highest point parallel to the outer edge of the crater and the lowest point 20 meters underground. The roof was made of concrete and covered with soil about 2-3 meters thick. The wall was divided into 2 parts. The outer wall was 1.5 meters thick, the inner wall was 2 meters thick, and 0.7 meters of soil was sandwiched between the inner and outer walls to protect against cosmic rays, solar wind, and meteorite impact. Due to the insufficient width of the tunnel, the huge lunar rover was parked outside the military base. Zhang Chen and Ziyash did not wait for a long time before the door of the military base opened. 2 officers who had spacesuits on skillfully leaped out and floated in their direction. The 2 officers stopped in front of Zhang Chen, saluted, then led the 2 into the base. The officer leading was Hu Zhangwen, a former Celestial Trade Navy frigate captain. Now, he served as a Earth Fleet Reserve officer and the head of the Moon military base. When he led the group into the base, he reported to Zhang Chen, "The soldiers have gathered in the central square and are ready to be reviewed. Do you want a tour of the base first, or would you like to head to the square now?" "Let's go to the square first. We don't want to let our boys wait too long," Zhang Chen said with a smile. "Roger." Zhang Chen examined the outline of the entire military base as he followed closely behind. The interior of the building was designed as a partition. An airlock was built between the partitions. If the building was damaged and air leaked, the airlock can be dropped to isolate the damaged area. Those who didn't have time evacuate could enter the hibernation chambers designed on both sides of the safety tunnel to wait for rescue. This kind of design was similar to the design of Lunar City. Before the shield technology made any more advancements, this was the most feasible option. 1,500 soldiers gathered in the central square of the military base, and they were arranged in a uniform square. The elites from all member states were indeed better than the reserve of Celestial Trade. When Zhang Chen did military training in school, he always thought that even with the best posture, a bullet was the same to everyone. However, now he wholeheartedly felt that a good posture was the most intuitive embodiment of a soldier. Even with only 1/6 of the gravity, these soldiers were as steady as sculptures. Just this alone was enough to impress Zhang Chen. The 2 months of training was not wasted. Just as Zhang Chen inspected the future soldiers of the Earth Fleet, It was late into the night in the capital 400,000 kilometers away. In the center of the bustling world, a man in a suit walked quickly across the street. He stopped under a bronze street light, took a note out from his pocket, and confirmed the address again. He then turned into the side alley and entered an ordinary coffee shop. He was on K Street. If the eye of the storm of the 2008 financial crisis was Wall Street, then K Street was the ever-changing international political center. This street was home to a large number of think tanks, lobby groups, and public relations companies. International headquarters, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund were also here. There were a large number of lobbying groups and well-known lobbyists with limitless power gathered on this street and conducted political trades every day. Thus, K Street was renowned to all, or infamous. The information you want. The man took a document from his coat and threw it on the table as he took a deep breath and sat across from the woman. All the candidates are listed on it, from their political views to their license plate number. If you want to know the probability of winning for each person, I have a dedicated team to serve you. Of course, the payment must be calculated again. The payment is next to you. The woman raised her chin slightly and used her eyes to point in the direction of the money. The man paused and followed her eyes to the right-hand side of the seat. A black suitcase rested by his feet. The man grabbed the suitcase as his expression suddenly changed and he looked at the woman with strangeness. "I guess it won't be Zimbabwe." The woman lifted her glass and gracefully sipped the red wine. After she put down the glass, she reached for the documents on the table and nonchalantly said, "You can open it." The man hesitated for a moment, then he picked up the suitcase and opened it. After he saw the green, he quickly closed the suitcase. It was enough. Not Zimbabwean dollars, nor Walmart coupons. There was at least $200,000 in dollars in the suitcase, and maybe even more. What made the man puzzled was why she chose to pay in cash. Only two types of people carried so much cash: drug dealers and fugitives. Either way, never a good person. Okay, actually. The man hesitated, and finally decided to continue to promote his business. In fact, you can find these things online. Other than Hill, who delayed her speech for some reason, other candidates all have already finished their election speech. I mean, if you just want to figure out their license plate number, there is absolutely no need to find me. My ability is far more than that, is it? The woman looked at the document in her hand and responded nonchalantly. The man opened his mouth. It seemed that the customer was not interested in his ability. Just when he had given up and was ready to get up and leave, the woman who sat across of him took a piece of paper from the document and gently dropped it in front of him. "I need you to do something for me." The slender fingers tapped on the photo. "Investigate him. I need to know everything about him. The more interesting the information, the better." "You know what I'm referring to, Joseph Kennedy." When the man recognized the man in the photo, his face suddenly changed into hesitancy. "I remember you said." The woman looked at the man, and her red lips formed a mysterious smile. "Your ability is far more than just figuring out their license plate number." "You don't know." The man showed a hint of struggle laced with a hint of fear. "The Kennedy family is part of the B-City Consortium. There is so much going on behind all of this, and it is so deep that it can drown anyone who dares to test their depths." When the man said this, he suddenly noticed a faint disdain in the woman's eyes. Yes, it was disdain. He was sure he was not mistaken. Expressed disdain for the B-City Consortium. Who was she on behalf of? Morgan, Rockefeller, Russians, or who? Or the fabled? He hesitated for a moment before he finally gritted his teeth. If the price is right, in any case, he should listen to the price first. If the price was not suitable, then it was not too late to refuse. The woman opened her left hand and put up 5 fingers. $500,000. The man tried to propose a number. 50 million. The woman said in an understatement. $50 million. His heart jerked. The man took a deep breath, and his expression changed several times before it formed a bitter smile. It was a price he could not reject, even if he knew this money would bring danger to his life. "Your answer?" The woman raised an eyebrow. This question was completely redundant. No one could refuse such a generous reward on K Street. Even if the bet was his own life, he would willingly gamble it. The man took a deep breath, stood up, and extended his right hand. Richard Meyer, that is my name. I don't know if I am lucky enough to know the name of my employer. No. The woman looked at the document in her hand and replied in a whisper. Even the refusal was so elegant that Meyer, who had his right hand in the air, couldn't be angry. Well, it doesn't matter. Meyer retracted his right hand, shrugged, and looked around. Then he tapped on the table and lowered his voice. Wait for my message. The woman nodded, without looking up at him at all. Go now. 1147 returning to Earth. In the blink of an eye, 3 days had passed since Zhang Chen arrived in Lunar City. During these 3 days, the mayor of Lunar City, Tang Weiji, took Zhang Chen and Zai Asha on a tour of the city, from the ice exploration wells, to the mining station that collected helium-3, to the nuclear fusion power station that transported electricity to half of Asia, and the wireless power transmission station over 100 square meters in size. Zhang Chen was able to gain a clear view of Lunar City's development. In general, Lunar City had a strong mining industry with a growing tourism industry. The city was a giant mine with complete mining facilities, ground transportation, power supply, communication scheduling, production management and living service facilities. According to Tang Weiji, to fully develop the potential of the city, at least 50,000 permanent residents would be needed. Before the living space issues could be solved, the limit of the permanent population of the city would be this number. The shield technology must be dependent on the progress in Wanghai of the apocalypse. Zhang Chen thought, it's time to return to the apocalypse. With all officials of Lunar City's best wishes, Zhang Chen and Zai Asha boarded the returning spacecraft. After they returned to Celestial City, the first thing he did was to convene experts of Future Heavy Industries and Celestial Trade and held a seminar on the moon elevator. Under the guise of the group of experts, the engineering plan for the moon elevator was quickly developed. Zhang Chen immediately discussed this matter with Kelvin and delegated the work after the feasibility of the project was confirmed. With the boss personally instructing this matter, the moon elevator project began to move. Future Heavy Industries immediately dispatched engineers to Lunar City for site inspection. The graphene plant in Ange Island Industrial Park began to operate at maximum capacity. The capacity that was originally idle due to the completion of the space elevators started to ramp up again. The total length of the entire moon elevator was 200 kilometers with a budget of $3.7 billion. The project of course was still executed by Future Heavy Industries and was expected to be delivered to Celestial Trade in the first half of next year. When Zhang Chen delegated all the work on hand, it was already the 13th. After he stayed in space for so long, he finally returned to the surface. When his feet stepped onto the soft soil again, he had an illusion of long-lostness. The seagulls soared in the air, the dolphins jumped out of the water. The warm and hazy sunshine scattered on his face, and the sea breeze that blew in his face was mixed with the fragrance of coconut. These ordinary things on Earth just felt like home. Zhang Chen went straight home when he returned to Koro Island by helicopter, as early as 3 days ago, when he worked to develop the plan for the moon elevator in Celestial City. Zai Asha had already returned. She should be working today. Natasha also shouldn't be home since she checked in at the embassy from Monday to Friday. In this case, there was only one person who could open the door for him. When Zhang Chen knocked on the door of the mansion, a stunning figure leaped into his arms. Zhang Chen spun Aisha in the air, stroked her dark brown hair, and whispered to her, "Did you miss me?" Aisha nodded with force, buried her face in his chest, and rubbed her nose against him. Finally, a smile blossomed from the usually expressionless face. After Aisha took the suitcase from Zhang Chen's hand, she ran upstairs. Zhang Chen hung his coat at the door, then went to the bathroom to take a shower. When he opened the door again, a change of clothes was placed in a plastic basket. Looking at the neatly folded clothes, he felt her meticulous care to detail. The clothes smelled like sunlight. After he changed into clean clothes, Zhang Chen wiped his hair with a towel and returned to the living room. Looking at Aisha, who sat on the sofa in the living room, he sat next to her. Has anything happened in Nippon while I was away? Aisha shook her head. The SIB suspended their espionage activities in Nippon. At least they stopped their contact with the Nippon politicians. We are basically in an armistice with the SIB, although I don't know how long this can last. Also, on another note, why did you ask us to pay attention to Joseph Kennedy? Is there anything special about him? If it's just because of B-City Consortium, guess who I met in Lunar City? I met Loki, Zhang Chen said. He discussed forming an alliance. He said that if Joseph Kennedy becomes president, they will give Nippon to us and also join the Earth Defense Alliance. Did you agree? Aisha looked at Zhang Chen. Of course not. Zhang Chen shrugged. This piece of meat is too fat and I'm afraid it may taste bad. No matter from which point of view, the B-City Consortium's proposal was considered generous. If there was a problem, then it was probably because the proposal was too generous. It was generous to the point that Zhang Chen couldn't trust them. Obviously, Aisha also shared the same perspective. According to your instructions, we have begun to investigate Joseph Kennedy, who is responsible for this mission. Penny. Zhang Chen nodded. The name rang a bell in his head. Zhu Yu and she were the first batch of graduated agents, a veteran in ghost agents. She should be able to take care of the matter with no mistakes. The Earth Defense Alliance was headed on the right track, but there was still a long way to go to integrate resources around the world. The biggest obstacle to this was the ruler of the old world. As the leader of the world's largest military body, as long as the A still existed for one day, the sphere of influence of the Earth Defense Alliance could only stay in the Eastern Hemisphere. However, the issue was that both sides controlled the switch to destroy the world. The two sides could only test away from the opponent's bottom line. Although the two sides still maintained high-standard economic and trade cooperation, the signs of the Cold War had quietly emerged. If this balance could be maintained, the situation would be fine. However, if the fine balance was broken by one side, then the situation may deteriorate to the point of no return. Who was the most likely to tip the balance? Zhang Chen's answer was undoubtedly the He thought he had a theoretical basis. After all, the country changed its president every 4 years. Without considering the differences between the two parties, the differences within the same party alone were visible enough. If a madman was elected without any common sense, the results would not be certain. In this case, whether or not the promise of B-City Consortium would be honored, it would not be a bad choice to push Joseph Kennedy to the position of the president. After all, Future Group still has close cooperation with B-City Consortium in the areas of desalination and VR finance. Of course, Zhang Chen would not be without reservation. Ghost agents in North America had started to collect Joseph Kennedy's scandals. Zhang Chen believed there was no politician without stains. With further digging, there must be something hidden underneath the surface. I will go back to the apocalypse in a few days. I'll leave everything here to you. Zhang Chen rubbed Aisha's hair. Aisha put her hand over his and docilely nodded. MHMM. 1148 north of the Great Wall. It was still the middle of autumn, but a hint of winter's chillness already lingered in the air. The battling checkpoint was a tourist attraction more than 30 years ago. Today, more than 30 years later, it had been transformed into a military outpost. With this ancient wall as the boundary, the north was the wilderness, the world of mutants, and the south was the ruins, the world of survivors. In general, survivors in Shengjing were much more fortunate than the survivors in Wanghai. Although both cities were in ruins, many landmark buildings survived. These well-preserved buildings became the base of survivors and provided shelters for survival. In addition, as the political center of Pan-Asia cooperation, the necessities here were more than 10 times that of Wanghai. The necessities here were not just food, clothing, medical supplies, but also raw materials and energy such as steel, rare earth minerals, oil, helium-3, and even well-preserved industrial machine tools. The industrial machine tools here were different from the hand-built machine tools built by engineers of the 6th Street through 3D printers. The former was the crystallization of technology, and the latter was the knowledge of the working people. It was evident how much of a lead the survivors of Shangjing gained in the early days. Before the establishment of NAC, there were more than 100 large and small settlements in Wanghai. In Shangjing, more than 1,000 settlements were scattered across the city, with hundreds of large survivor camps like the 6th Street and Luding Town. The survivors never unified here. They had made their own rules, such as determining the safe area within the Third Ring Road and prohibiting murder, robbery, and theft. Offenders would be wanted by all survivors. Another example was the outpost in the Battling Sinuk area. In order to prevent extreme mutants with a crystal index of 300 or more from migrating from the north, the survivors of Shangjing jointly contributed to the modification of the city wall of Battling. They repaired the guardhouse and machine gun bunker, and each settlement took turns guarding, even in the harshest winters. This iron law never changed. It's September. Right. On the guardhouse, 2 soldiers stood at each end, leaned against the wall, and gazed into the grey wasteland. Automatic rifles dangled around their waist and magazines were tied against their body. From their appearance, they were from different survivor camps. What date is it? The 15th. The one in the blue scarf didn't seem to enjoy chatting. Only when the survivor next to him asked a question would he respond in a concise manner. Most of the time, he stood there in silence, not moving, and gazed into the distant horizon, or dozing off. It's only been 15 days, Fu K. The unshaven man spat out of the guardhouse and grinned. Do you believe it? In another 2 months, if I spit down, it will turn into ice. The man in the blue scarf barely moved the corner of his mouth and did not speak. This state continued, and time quickly passed by. The sky gradually darkened, and the distant horizon was covered with a layer of foggy tulle. With the gust of the northern wind, the fog writhed its enchanting curve and gradually climbed over the wasteland. It rose above the guardhouse and covered the concrete-reinforced wall. Fog, the unshaven man said, raising his head and looking into the sky. He then muttered to himself, the weather is going to change. The fog gradually thickened and formed another wall on the distant horizon. Suddenly, in the heavy fog, a black outline gradually emerged. The blue scarf man seemed to notice the anomaly in the fog as he frowned. He reached for the binocular on his chest and examined that direction. Did you see something? The unshaven man also noticed something at this moment, but when he reached for his binocular, he did not find anything. Then he remembered that he left it in the barracks. The fog is too thick to see anything. The man wearing a scarf pressed his eyes against the binocular as he responded. At the same time, he pressed the intercom on his shoulder and spoke. Something is going on outside. Roger that. 4 or 5 soldiers with rifles left the barracks as they yawned and headed to the guardhouse. At the same time, a drone flew out and slowly flew toward the wilderness outside the city wall. The blue scarf man tossed the binocular at the unshaven man. Then he kneeled down and took out a shell about the size of an adult thigh. He picked up a rag and wiped the ash on it before he walked to the deployed cannon. If you have seen enough, come and help. Fu K, the big guy is being loaded. Are we overreacting? The unshaven snorted and took one last peek with the binocular. Just as he was about to go help, he seemed to catch a glimpse of a bright red emblem from behind the thick fog. A sickle? A hammer? The binocular dropped to the ground, and horror immediately overwhelmed him. His lips trembled for a while before he finally squeezed out 2 words from his trembling lips. The Fu K? The earth shook and the steel roared. The torrent of steel rolled from the boundless wasteland, and the endless roar swept across the wall, swept over the guard tower, and swept through the continent. That was not fog. That was the dust picked up by tank tracks. The moment they recognized the shadow, the expression of everyone in the guardhouse changed. The stones in the corner began to jump in uneasiness. Even separated by a kilometer in distance, everyone could feel the tremor of the earth. CCC.P? Their teeth trembled, and the soldiers in the bunker loaded their weapons while cursing in fear. CCCP tanks? No, impossible. Didn't the former regimes all get out? Push up the cannons, quick, idiot. Use AT bombs. That one in red paint. The entire military outpost began to mobilize like boiling water after they noticed the strange situation outside. The soldiers rushed to battle positions with automatic rifles, and with the cannons loaded, they pushed it to firing position. These fortifications were originally prepared for mutants. No one ever thought that one day it would be used against the polar bears and tanks. A speaker was extended out from the guardhouse. Listen, whatever you are doing, stop immediately. The armored flood continued its advancement with no response. The commander repeated the same statement in Russian. It was still silence that responded to them, and the roar of the tank tracks flattened the earth. The commander smashed the speaker against the ground, took off his intercom, and a glimpse of heroicness quickly appeared on his face. Fight! Boom! 5 cannons responded to his roar. The infantry artillery shells fired and made 5 orange trajectories in the air. However, against the roaring steel torrent, they were as insignificant as toothpicks. Posh! The shells scraped against the front armor of the tanks and plunged into the mud. It left only a shallow dent. The unshaven man looked at the tank formation outside the guardhouse and was in so much despair that he even stopped moving. The cannons invincible against mutants were useless. They couldn't even make the roaring steel monster pause for a second. The 5 cannons on the wall seemed to ignite a certain signal. Above the rushing steel torrent, a row of icy barrels slowly lifted and pointed in the direction of the guardhouse. Without the slightest omen, the barrels ignited. The unshaven man used the last glimmer of light to spot the concrete wall collapsing backward. Chapter 1149 Ceremonial Ship Launching. A long time ago, the apocalypse only gave Jiang Chen the feeling of despair. And despair. The streets were blocked by zombies and mutants. The raiders and the cannibals raged, and the mutated humans occasionally ravaged the land. In order to explain the origin of his food, he must carefully weave lies and then create his own bloody road among the bloodthirsty mutants and cruel robbers. Only when he returned to the modern world did he get an opportunity to breathe. From the leak of the X2 bacteria to the later mutant flood, from the Supreme Rebellion to the subsequent war with the Northern Alliance area, troubles forced him to move forward. He must protect the home he created, protect the people that loved him, and those that he loved. Now, the situation seemed to be reversed. Zombies had disappeared from Wanghai, and mutants migrated away to the wilderness without survivors. There were no complicated international relationships. There were no regional conflicts that must be handled with care. On this ruin, Nak was a well-deserved king. Even something as strong as the Northern Alliance area, left behind from the previous world, must surrender to Nak's might. The apocalypse became his peace. Only in the apocalypse could Jiang Chen temporarily put down the fatigue accumulated in the modern world and enjoy the rare leisure. On the east bank of Wanghai, next to Liding Town, the bright steel hull was pushed down into the seawater, and a brand new destroyer floated beside the rusty Bohai. The flag of the new Pan-Asia Cooperation, NAC, swayed in the sea breeze. The magnificent steel ship stood firmly in the rolling waves. The 3 electromagnetic pulse cannons were arranged in a stepped manner. They neatly pointed to the sky and highlighted their fierce firepower. Jiang Chen stood on the dock and examined the warship not far from him. The waves rolled against the coast and his heart rolled with it. The launch of the electromagnetic destroyer meant that the NAC Navy finally took its first step. Although there were still many shortcomings compared to the Beluga station, NAC made a monumental breakthrough. NAC had conquered the land and was destined to conquer the ocean and bring the world under its banner. Our first warship. Cheng Weigo walked to Jiang Chen's side and looked at the brand new destroyer. Emotionally he said, "It is finally built." Under the name of building a dock for the maintenance of the Bohai aircraft carrier, the shipyard was built. The bottom line of the Beluga station was slowly eclipsed, and the destroyer finally entered the sea. This was only the first one. There would be many ships in the future. Not only destroyers, but NAC also developed submarines and built the navy based on the standards of pre-war PAC. Is there a name for her? Jiang Chen raised his chin toward the destroyer. Not yet, General, Please give her a name. Zhang Chen thought for a moment and then looked up. Let's call it Destroyer Ship Qingpu. The fishbone base built itself in Qingpu, Wanghai. Qingpu was the birthplace of Nak and was a fitting name for the first destroyer of Nak. DS Qingpu? Cheng Weigo nodded. I will tell people to engrave this name. Cheng Weigo paused and asked, I don't know which army the destroyer belongs to. I will establish a new navy division, independent of the army system, just like as order. It will have its own system and will directly obey orders from the Central Military Department. Zhang Chen looked at DS Qingpu and said, the Nak trade route has been in the hands of outsiders for too long. It's time to take it back. When Cheng Weigo heard the general's words, he solemnly straightened his back. As the head of the 1st Division, he was the confidant around Zhang Chen from the very beginning. Of course, he knew the foreigner the general referred to. The next step is to build anti-aircraft cannons along the shore, echoing the electromagnetic pulse cannons of Chongming Island. We are currently not a threat to the Beluga station at sea, so we must start from land infrastructures. Although we are on good terms with Beluga station, you can never forget that this is the wasteland. Roger, Cheng Weigo shouted. Good. I'm going to head back now. Zhang Chen nodded, turned, and walked to the armored car behind him. Cheng Weigo looked at the back of the armored car and watched it disappear at the end of the street. When Zhang Chen arrived home, the aromatic smell of cooked meat lingered in the mansion. Every time he came back, the mansion was always bustling. Not only the Nak granary was filled, but the fridge in the mansion was also full. Although they never lacked food, items such as seafood which can't be stored for long, could only be enjoyed during Zhang Chen's return. Today was no exception. When Zhang Chen passed through Coconut Island, he brought a fridge full of fresh seafood with him. Therefore, the girls voted unanimously to eat hot pot for dinner that night. Yao Yao prepared her original hot pot soup base in the kitchen. Sun Zhao, who only knew how to serve the plates, helped to bring the hot pot to the table. All eyes stared straight at the bubbling hot pot soup. Lin Lin's little hand squeezed her fork tightly as she swallowed. Ziru held her face with her hands and smiled while she swayed her slim legs under the table. She was humming her favorite song that she wrote. Beef rolls, mutton rolls, and delicious cuttlefish. Which one to eat first? Hot pot was really more delicious with more people. The soup boiled, and Lin, who couldn't wait, tossed a plateful of mutton roll into the boiling hot pot, and soon the fragrance spread over the house. All eyes stared at the meat rolls rolling in the soup, and even Zhang Chen couldn't wait for the meat to boil. Amongst the cheers and laughter, the family ate hot pot and left a mess on the table. After everyone cleaned the dishes together, Yao Yao returned to her room to read. Lin went to the Lin Institute. As for Ziru, she went to the backyard. Every night, she practiced her ability to detonate crystals in the backyard as she tried to unlock her the 3rd hidden gene code. It was already her habit. A habit that cost a lot of crystals. There weren't really many things for entertainment in the Apostle Alps, other than enjoying food. There didn't seem to be many interesting activities. Most people chose to spend their extra time at work. Even if they don't have a job, they often found something to do, such as practicing shooting and learning. In fact, Zhang Chen also thought about unlocking his hidden genetic code, except he couldn't find a suitable way to practice his fury ability. He couldn't just lose his temper every day. He thought his temper was pretty mild. This year, 600 babies were born. After Sun Zhao entered the office, she grabbed 2 cans of beer and walked to Zhang Chen. She handed him a can and leaned against the bookshelf. Does this count as a lot or too little? Zhang Chen asked. Sun Zhao smiled and said with a sly voice, this is considered a small baby boom. 4 years ago, it was rare to see a few babies at the 6th Street. Thanks to this, the 6th Street has recently opened a baby goods store and has started to sell things like diapers. Zhang Chen nodded as he showed a pleasant smile. This is great. It indicates that our survivors have settled. It doesn't matter what happens to other people. Sun Zhao interrupted. She stared at her toes and whispered, I'm thinking, we should also have a child. Zhang Chen sighed slightly, and after a moment of silence, he whispered, let him be born in the last days. Sun Zhao's lips were closed, and her eyes showed a hint of confusion. She also knew, perhaps it would be better to wait just a bit longer, but just watching more and more children in the base strung a string in her heart that was never tough before. Yes, this family was very big and warm, but she always felt like something was missing. If she must say what, it may be a little life full of joy. Although she did not have the confidence to become a qualified mother, she vowed that she would work hard, give the maternal love she has never experienced before to her child, give her child a childhood that she has never enjoyed, and find all the irreparable things in that little life that she regretted before. Let's wait. Jiang Chen rubbed her soft hair. How much longer? Sun Jiao pouted. Her mood seemed to be down. When everything is over, Jiang Chen looked at Sun Jiao and looked at the yellowish-green sky outside the window and sighed softly. Someone must inherit all of this. Of course, maybe this was just his excuse. It was just that he also didn't have the self-confidence for the time being, to take up the responsibility of being a father. Chapter 1150 Harmonious Scene. It was just daybreak when Jiang Chen opened his eyes and slightly moved his shoulders, only to find that his arms were firmly pressed. As if Sun Ziru sensed Jiang Chen's movement, she muttered while she changed into a more comfortable position and continued to use his arm as a pillow. Sister, Ziru can't eat anymore. With her cherry red lips slightly pouted, Sun Jiao turned around and put her arm around Jiang Chen's neck. With a sweet smile, she whispered in her dream, "Just sleep for a bit longer." Looking at the peaceful sleeping beauty, Jiang Chen smiled. No wonder they are sisters. The way they look in their sleep is exactly the same. But because he was observing too closely, he noticed the unnaturalness of Sun Jiao's face. "You're awake, right?" Just as he said those words, he saw Sun Jiao's long eyelashes move. Although her trick was spotted, Sun Jiao didn't plan to just let him escape. Her lips slightly opened and exaggerated snoring drifted out between her lips. "This girl." Jiang Chen smiled and shook his head. "Get up. There is still something we must do. Don't stay in bed too long." Just when Jiang Chen tried to tickle Sun Jiao, Sun Ziru on the other side began to move. "Hey, you noticed?" She rubbed her sleepy eyes and wobblingly sat up. Sun Ziru, still not completely awake yet, smiled at Jiang Chen with blushed cheeks. Her messy hair did not interfere with her beauty, nor did the loose pajamas on her body. Instead, they added a unique charm to her. Sun Ziru watched Jiang Chen stare at her and she tilted her head. Then she smiled with a bit of confusion and a bit of shyness before she put her finger on her lips, before saying good morning. "Don't you want to do something first?" Although he really wanted to do something, rationality ultimately won. Jiang Chen snuck out from the bedroom, took some winter clothes from the bedside table, and got dressed. He leaned down and kissed the two on the forehead before he left the bedroom. When he went downstairs, Yao Yao, who was yawning, had already put delicious breakfast on the table. As for the foodie Lin Lin, she already began to eat. Jiang Chen moved a chair over and sat next to Yao Yao, who happily pressed her little head against his shoulder and her pair of feet swayed in happiness. With how sleepy Yao Yao looked, Jiang Chen couldn't help but feel a little distressed. Her symptoms of lethargy never went away despite her nutrition improving and her anemia being cured. There were even signs of aggravation. Her explanation was that the inhibitors used for the hibernation chambers had side effects similar to allergy symptoms, but Jiang Chen always suspected that it may be not as simple as the inhibitors' side effects. Sister Sun Jiao and Sister Sun Ziru are still sleeping? You don't have to wake them up. Let the two sleepy heads sleep for a bit longer, Jiang Chen said while he rubbed Yao Yao's fluffy hair. "What's wrong?" "Nothing." Yao Yao shook her head and began to pout. Jiang Chen looked at Yao Yao, slightly confused. It may be his illusion, but he felt that the little girl's emotion seemed to be low. Is it because she didn't sleep well? If you feel like you didn't sleep enough, don't force yourself, or go back to sleep for a bit longer. No need. Yao Yao has already woken up. The small head shook back and forth as she clearly tried to act strong. "It's all because you are here, that's why Yao Yao is getting up so early. If it's normal days, I'm usually the one who prepares breakfast, Lin Lin chewed on an egg roll and glared at Zhang Chen. Not at all. Obviously I just happened to get up today. Yao Yao blushed and eyed Lin Lin, but her eyes didn't show any fierceness. Humphrey. Lin Lin swallowed the food in her mouth and spat out her tongue. With a tone of preaching, she began to lecture. The delicious egg roll cannot fly into my mouth. If you don't let some big bad guy know, he will take your efforts for granted. If you just watch in silence, your presence will be lower and lower, until in the end, your feelings will be like your height, always so little. After leaving these words, Lin Lin did not give Yao Yao a chance to respond. She quickly put the last piece of egg roll into her mouth, took her plate, and headed to the kitchen. It won't happen. Lin Lin's words seemed to pull a string in Yao Yao's mind. Yao Yao pouted while her hands gently dragged onto Zhang Chen's sleeves and tightened. She lowered her head while she muttered, "Humphrey, why are you acting cool? Obviously you can't grow taller too." Grow taller? Yao Yao should still be able to grow taller. Lin Ling shouldn't be able to grow taller. After all, the bones were replaced with titanium alloys. If she can grow taller, then that's an issue. Without understanding the conversation between Lin Lin and Yao Yao, Zhang Chen sat there, completely lost with half of an egg roll still stuffed in his mouth. What's happening today? After he finished breakfast, Zhang Chen forcibly stopped Yao Yao from doing dishes and even picked up her up to send her to bed. Zhang Chen saw the little girl blush as he tucked her in, leaned down, and kissed her on her forehead before he left the bedroom. Back in the kitchen, Zhang Chen was about to clean up the plate, only to find that everything was cleaned. He quickly realized what happened and smiled at the sight. Although he always bantered with Lin Lin, he always knew that contrary to her bad mouth, Lin Lin was actually a very gentle person, just unable to express her feeling, or expressed it in the oddest way. As he pushed open the door, the icy wind gusted into his face. He moved his stiff limbs past the door before he ventured into the wind. It was mid-September, but the wind brought on the resemblance of winter. With Cheng Weigo, Zhao Guang and several guards, Zhang Chen stepped onto the wall of the fishbone base. After the soldiers on duty saw him, they turned to face him, straightened their back and saluted. Their pupils were filled with respect and pride from the bottom of their heart. In Nak's territory, and even to the more distant south, California, on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, the Nak general was a fabled name. Zhang Chen looked at the rundown high-rise buildings outside the city wall and suddenly asked, "Where did the wind blow from?" Cheng Weigo quickly thought about it and replied immediately, "It should be from the north." Zhang Chen nodded and set his eyes to the far north and spoke to himself. Did the northern wind already start to blow? It's getting colder and colder.